What if a man who mastered power through elegance, silence, and manipulation awoke in a world where etiquette is extinct and authority rots faster than the dead? No courts to raid, no hierarchy to exploit, no audience to impress, only a virus that erased civilization and the terrifying truth that influence means nothing when there's no one left to rule. This isn't a story about survival. It's a story about what power becomes after the world ends. If you love psychological crossovers, cold intelligence, and stories where brains face extinction-level chaos, subscribe now. Because when Jinshi enters the Resident Evil universe, the apocalypse doesn't bow. Jinshi wakes to silence. Not the respectful silence of a court awaiting command. Not the polite hush of attendants holding their breath. This silence is wrong. It presses in from all directions, heavy and stale, like air that hasn't moved in days. Jinshi opens his eyes. The sky above him is the color of rusted steel. Smoke hangs low, unmoving, as if the world itself has stopped breathing. He lies on cold asphalt, the surface cracked and sticky beneath his palm. He pushes himself upright. The smell hits next. Blood. Old bloods. Drying bloods. Not fresh enough to panic over. Not clean enough to ignore. Jinshi's gaze sharpens immediately. Where am I? Buildings loom on either side of the street, once tall, once proud, now hollowed out. Windows shattered like broken teeth. Shop signs hang at crooked angles, swaying gently though there is no wind. Sirens stand frozen on poles, mouths open, eternally screaming into nothing. No voices answer them. Jinshi adjusts his breathing, posture straightening out of instinct. He expects, without realizing it, to hear footsteps, the soft rustle of silk, the quiet acknowledgement of his awakening. Nothing comes. No palace walls. No guards. No servants kneeling with lowered eyes. Just decay. He rises to his feet slowly, brushing dust from his sleeves, only to pause. His clothing is intact, immaculate, entirely out of place. Silk in a cemetery. Jinshi looks down the street. A car lies overturned, its door torn open from the inside. Dark stains smear the pavement, leading away from it, dragged toward an alley that disappears into shadow. He follows the trail with his eyes, expression unreadable. So he murmurs to himself, voice steady, cultured, "This is not a dream." The city answers with nothing. Jinshi walks. Each step is measured, controlled. Even here, especially here, he refuses to rush. Rushing is for people without information. He passes a storefront window and stops. His reflection stares back at him. Calm face, perfect hair, composed eyes. Untouched. Behind his reflection, a body slumps against the glass from the inside. Skin gray, jaw slack, eyes clouded. Jinshi does not flinch. He studies it the way he would study a political rival. No visible wounds. No sign of struggle. But the mouth is open too wide, teeth stained dark. Infection, then. Interesting. A sound breaks the silence. Not humans. A wet shuffle echoes from the alley ahead. Jinshi steps back, not in fear, but calculation. His hand moves instinctively toward where a fan or blade should be. There is nothing. The thing emerges slowly. Once a man, now something else. Its movements are uncoordinated, driven by hunger rather than will, eyes unfocused, skin torn. It does not look at Jinshi with recognition. Only appetite. Jinshi meets its gaze and feels nothing. No intimidation. No pressure. No unspoken hierarchy. This is new, he says quietly. The creature lunges. Jinshi steps aside with practiced grace. The movement is elegant, precise, learned from years of navigating dangerous rooms filled with smiling enemies. The creature crashes into a wall, snarling. Jinshi watches it recover. There is no mind here to manipulate. No pride to provoke. No fear to exploit. Status is meaningless. He backs away slowly, keeping distance, retreating not because he is weak, but because engagement offers no advantage. The creature follows. Jinshi turns and runs. Not in panic. In assessment. He ducks through a shattered doorway, slips behind a counter, and exits through the back as the creature stumbles after him. He moves through the city like a ghost, memorizing turns, landmarks, escape paths. When he finally stops, breath steady, he realizes something far more unsettling than monsters. There is no order. No banners. No guards. No chain of command. Even chaos has a structure. This does not. He climbs the steps of a crumbling municipal building and looks out over the city. Fires burn unchecked in the distance. Smoke coils upward, indifferent. Streets are empty, not because people are hiding, but because there is no one left to hide. Jinshi grips the stone railing. All his life, power meant understanding the room. Reading the glances. Tracking whispers. Pulling invisible strings. But this world has no court. And without a court, power has nowhere to sit. For the first time, Jinshi feels something dangerously close to irrelevance. Not fear. Obsolescence. His lips curve slightly, not in amusement, but resolve. Very well, he says to the dead city. Then I'll have to learn what rules remain. Far below, another inhuman moan echoes through the streets. Jinshi turns away from the skyline and disappears into the ruins, mind already adapting. If civilization is dead, then influence must be rebuilt. From the survivors up, Jinshi learns the truth the moment the gun is raised. Not shouted, not shaken, steady. A rifle barrel emerges from behind a burned-out truck, aimed directly at his chest, then another, then a third. Jinshi stops walking. Slowly, careful, lying. Hands visible, palms open. The survivors step into view, 4 of them, faces hollowed by exhaustion, clothes layered in scavenged practicality, fingers tight around triggers that have already decided what they're capable of. No one bows. No one stares in awe. One of them spits on the ground, too clean. Another narrows her eyes, too calm. Jinshi offers a polite smile out of instinct. It's the wrong move. Don't, the woman snaps. Whatever you're trying, it won't work. Jinshi blinks. What? He adjusts immediately. The smile softens, loses its edge, becomes harmless. Still wrong. The man with the rifle steps closer. Who are you with? No one, Jinshi answers truthfully. That's a lie. Jinshi tilts his head. Why would I lie about being alone? Because no one like you survives alone. That lands. Jinshi finally understands the equation. In his world, beauty was leverage. A signal of protection. A mark of proximity to power. Here, it's evidence. You look like bait, another survivor mutters, or worse, umbrella. At the name, Jinshi notes the change instantly. Shoulders tense. Weapons lift higher. Fear sharpened into hatred. Useful information. I don't know what umbrella is, Jinshi says calmly. The rifle presses closer. That's exactly what they'd say. Jinshi exhales slowly. Every instinct he's honed, every subtle tilt of posture, every measured word, has always drawn people closer. Now it pushes them away. Strip him, one of them says. Jinshi stiffens, not in pride, but calculation. That won't be necessary, he replies evenly. The woman laughs, a short, humorless sound. See, he still thinks he has a say. Hands grabbed him. Rough, impatient. They tear open his outer robe, searching for weapons, devices, proof of deception. They find nothing. No gun. No knife. No vial. Just silk. Jesus, someone mutters, you really are useless. That word cuts deeper than a blade. Useless. Jinshi is shoved to his knees. The rifle barrel lowers, just slightly, but never leaves his line of sight. You walk into our territory looking like that, the man says. You put a target on all of us. Jinshi looks up at them. Really looks. These people aren't cruel. They're terrified. Their suspicion isn't personal. It's survival. I didn't mean to draw attention, Jinshi says. That's the problem, the woman snaps. You don't get to choose that anymore. A distant sound interrupts them. A scream. Cut short. Every survivor freezes. Weapons swing outward, scanning the ruined street. Their formation tightens, not around Jinshi, but away from him. Instinct overrules hostility. Jinshi watches closely. Hierarchy still exists here. It's just built on fear instead of favor. Move, the man orders Jinshi. Slow, any tricks you die. Jinshi nods once, understood. They force him into their group as they retreat down an alley, keeping him in the center like dangerous cargo. As they move, Jinshi feels it fully now. Eyes on him. Hands ready. Suspicion coiled. His presence increases risk. In the palace, people competed to stand near him. Here, standing near him gets you killed. The realization settles cold and sharp. Beauty is not currency here. It's a liability. They stop inside a fortified storefront. Barricades, crates, blood-stained tiles hastily scrubbed clean. The survivors argue in hushed, furious whispers. We should dump him. He'll bring them. He's already marked. Jinshi listens. Says nothing. Silence, he's learned, is often louder than defense. Finally, the woman turns back to him. You want to live? Yes, Jinshi answers immediately. Then change. He looks down at himself, at the torn silk, the immaculate skin, the untouched face. I see, he says quietly. They toss him a filthy jacket, stained, heavy, anonymous. Jinshi takes it. And for the first time since waking in this world, he hesitates before putting something on, not out of disgust, but symbolism. When he pulls it over his shoulders, something essential disappears. Not his beauty. His protection. No one bows. No one looks impressed. No one lowers their weapon. Good. That night, as Jinshi sits alone in the corner of the barricaded room, listening to the survivors breathe and whisper and argue over rations, he reaches a dangerous conclusion. In this world, looking powerful gets you killed. And looking harmless might be the only way to survive. The first scream comes from outside the barricade. Not fear. Pain. Jinshi rises before anyone else does. The survivors react a half-second later, muscle memory snapping them into motion. Weapons up, positions taken, breaths held. Jinshi steps toward a cracked window. Don't, someone whispers harshly. Too late. He looks. The infected stumbles into the streetlight like a broken marionette. Its clothes hang in strips, skin gray, stretched too tight over bone. One eye is gone, not closed, not wounded, missing. The mouth works uselessly, jaw grinding as if chewing air. It doesn't roar. It doesn't threaten. It hungers. Jinshi feels no immediate life fear. Instead, curiosity. It walks past an abandoned car without looking, trips over rubble, slams into a wall, then corrects itself without frustration. No awareness of dignity. No concern for appearance. No hesitation. Is it ill? Jinshi asks softly. The man beside him swears under his breath, that's not sick. The infected turns its head. Slow, mechanical, and then it sees movement inside the store. Its posture changes instantly. Not recognition. Vexation. It lurches forward, hands slapping uselessly against the barricade. No words. No reaction to shouted warnings. No response to Jinshi's calm gaze. Jinshi steps closer. Stop, someone hisses. It hears you. He studies it carefully. In court, every human reaction followed rules. Pride flared under praise. Anger sharpened under insult. Desire softened resistance. This thing. Its eyes don't focus on him. They focus on flesh. Jinshi raises his voice. Can you understand me? The infected slams harder into the barrier, teeth snapping. No pause. No change. No hesitation. Jinshi tries again, slower, firmer, command threaded into tone the way he's always done. Enough. Nothing. The word passes through it like wind through a corpse. Realization dawns, not sudden but heavy. Status means nothing. Threats mean nothing. Charm, posture, command, all meaningless. The infected does not choose to disobey. It simply cannot obey. A gunshot cracks the air. The infected's head snaps sideways. It stumbles, drops, then tries to rise again, hands clawing uselessly at the ground. Another shot. Still moving. Why won't it stop? Jinshi asks, genuinely perplexed. The woman reloads, because it's already dead. The third shot ends it. Silence crashes down afterward, thick and final. Jinshi stares at the body. No relief. No triumph. No fear in its final moment. Just cessation of movement. He kneels before anyone can stop him. Are you insane? Someone snaps. Jinshi doesn't answer. He examines the corpse with unsettling calm. No tension in the face. No anger frozen into muscle. No trace of resentment. It died the same way it lived, empty. In the palace, enemies resisted because they wanted something. Power, status, recognition. This creature wanted nothing but consumption. It couldn't be bribed, couldn't be threatened, couldn't be convinced. You can't talk your way out of this world, the man with the rifle says quietly. Jinshi looks up at him. I know, he replies. The man blinks, he expected denial. What are they called? Jinshi asks. Infected, sometimes worse. Do they remember who they were? The survivors exchange glances. No, the woman says, that's the mercy. Jinshi stands slowly. That word mercy feels wrong. But he understands what she means. No shame remains in the dead. No regrets. No hierarchies. Only instinct. That night, Jinshi cannot sleep. The image replays in his mind, not the violence but the absence. A world where persuasion no longer functions. Where influence ends at the edge of consciousness. Where enemies don't fear death because they've already lost themselves. Jinshi sits up, staring into darkness. In his world, power worked because people cared. About survival. About reputation. About meanings. Here, meaning rots faster than flesh. He presses a hand to his chest. If this world strips humanity away, then survival won't come from ruling others. It will come from understanding what remains when nothing listens. Jinshi exhales slowly. Adaptation begins with humility. And for the first time, he is truly powerless. Fear has a sound. Jinshi learns this on the third night. It's not screaming, not crying, not even panic. It's the silence people use when they don't trust you enough to speak. The survivors sit in a loose circle inside what used to be a pharmacy. Shelves are stripped bare, glass taped instead of replaced. A single lantern flickers like it's struggling to justify staying lit. Jinshi watches. He does not speak. In court, silence was dominance. Here, silence is survival. He notices everything. The man with the rifle checks his ammo every 10 minutes too often. Fear of scarcity, fear of mistakes. He doesn't trust anyone else to count correctly. The woman near the door never sits with her back turned. She pretends it's habit. It is. She's been surprised before. One boy talks constantly, nervous explanations, unnecessary jokes, a flood of words meant to fill the space where courage should be. And then there's the quiet one, always watching Jinshi, always keeping distance, never blinking first. That one is dangerous. Jinshi used to read silk sleeves and lowered gazes. Now he reads clenched jaws and twitching fingers. The rules are simpler but harsher. Someone slides a can of food closer to themselves when Jinshi shifts position. Subtle, instinctive. He files it away. Later when they eat, no one says grace. No one shares stories. Each bite is calculated, swallowed quickly, eyes lifting between chews. Food isn't communal anymore. It's currency. Jinshi breaks his portion in half and pushes it toward the child. The room freezes. Hands tighten on weapons. He realizes his mistake instantly. Generosity here isn't kindness. It's a threat. What do you want? The woman demands. Jinshi blinks, nothing. No one believes him. In the palace, gifts created obligation. Here, gifts create suspicion. The boy hesitates, then slowly takes the food, never taking his eyes off Jinshi. Fear isn't chaos, Jinshi realizes. It's a structure, a new etiquette. Don't ask questions you don't need answered. Don't reveal skills you can't afford to lose. Don't trust anyone who seems fearless. That last rule circles him like a blade. That night, the quiet one finally speaks. You're not scared enough, he says. Jinshi turns his head. Should I be? Yes. Not anger. Not accusation. A warning. Jinshi nods slowly. In court, confidence commanded respect. Here, confidence invites a bullet. I'm learning, Jinshi says honestly. The man studies him, then looks away. That's permission. A small one, but real. Later, as Jinshi lies awake on cold tile, he reflects. Fear governs this world more efficiently than law ever did. No titles. No ranks. No divine authority. Just people measuring risk with every breath. And Jinshi understands something crucial. If he wants to survive, he cannot rise above fear. He must speak it fluently, not by inspiring it, but by respecting it. He closes his eyes. Tomorrow, he will stop trying to appear untouchable. Tomorrow, he will let them see him hesitate. Because in this world, fear is the only etiquette left. The helicopters don't arrive loudly. They arrive precisely. No panicked searchlights. No warning shots. No announcements. Just the steady mechanical thrum of machines that know exactly where they're going. Umbrella Corporation has entered the city. Jinshi recognizes it immediately, not by logo, but by behavior. Men in clean uniforms step over corpses without looking down. Boots never hesitate. Rifles stay lowered unless needed. Efficiency without emotion. Containment without mercy. They're here to save us, someone whispers. Jinshi doesn't believe that for a second. In the palace, monsters announced themselves. True Danger Warsilk smiled politely and spoke in formal language. Umbrella does not shout. It files reports. Jinshi watches from a rooftop as soldiers set up a perimeter. Tents appear, portable lights snap on. Samples are collected, blood, tissue, pieces of what used to be human, sealed in sterile containers. No prayers. No respect. Only documentation. A scientist speaks into a recorder. Subject shows advanced necrosis. Aggression remains consistent. Recommend incineration. Jinshi's expression doesn't change. But something inside him tightens. This isn't fear. It's recognition. These people don't see survivors, Jinshi murmurs. They see variables. A loudspeaker crackles to life. All civilians are to report for medical screening. The survivors tense instantly. They know better. Jinshi studies Umbrella's formation. Who stands closest to command? Who never removes their helmet? Who watches the scientists instead of the perimeter? In court, power revealed itself in seating arrangements. Here, it reveals itself in who is disposable. A soldier stumbles while escorting a coughing civilian. The man collapses. Convulsions. Blood. The reaction is immediate. 2 shots. A body bags. A clipboard notes. No pause. No discussion. The survivors recoil in horror. Jinshi exhales slowly. There it is, he says quietly. What? The woman asks. The court. She frowns. Those are just soldiers. No, Jinshi replies. Those are attendants. Umbrella doesn't rule through fear alone. It rules through procedure. Once a decision is written down, it becomes irreversible. The infected weren't cruel. They were empty. Umbrella is neither. It is deliberate. That night, Jinshi overhears a transmission. Containment failure acceptable. Data retrieval is priority. Acceptable. The word lands heavier than any scream he's heard so far. In the palace, lives were traded for stability. Here, cities are. Jinshi finally understands the shape of the true enemy. Not the dead, not the virus, but an institution that survives collapse by treating it as opportunity. He looks at the survivors huddled around a dim fire. They think Umbrella represents order. Jinshi knows better. Order without conscience is just violence with paperwork. And courts like this don't knight kings. They only knight time. Jinshi turns away from the lights, decision settling behind his eyes. He cannot charm Umbrella, cannot threaten it, cannot reason with it. But he can do something far more dangerous. He can observe it. And in any court, the one who understands the system best is never the one wearing the crown. Jinshi stops thinking of the virus as a disease on the 6th day. Diseases spread randomly. Diseases are mistakes of nature. This has timing. Jinshi notices it while listening, not watching. A survivor talks too much again, nervous, eager. Outbreak started 3 blocks from the lab, then another near the docks, then nothing for weeks. Jinshi tilts his head slightly. Patterns emerge. Not medical ones. Political ones. He starts asking questions, not directly, never directly. He learned better in court. Instead, he asks around them. Who was evacuated first? Which zones were sealed instead of rescued? Where supplies vanished fastest? Who disappeared after cooperating? The answers don't form a map. They form a hierarchy. At night, Jinshi studies confiscated documents scavenged from an abandoned checkpoint. He doesn't understand the science, but he doesn't need to. He understands language. Containment success acceptable. Loss within projected tolerance. Population density optimal for trial phase. Trial, not treatment. Jinshi exhales slowly. In the palace, poison was politics made liquid. Here, the virus is politics made flesh. It punishes districts, rewards compliance, erases inconvenient populations. Not chaos. Policy. He remembers the way nobles once spoke of peasants. Numbers. Resources. Necessary losses. The same tone lives in these reports. Only now it wears lab coats. A survivor argues nearby. Why don't they just end it, cure it? Jinshi answers before thinking. Because the problem isn't the virus. They all look at him. The problem is control, he continues calmly, and control improves when fear is renewable. Silence. No one contradicts him. They feel it already. Jinshi realizes something unsettling. The scientists are not in charge. They are wolves. The real power belongs to those who decide where outbreaks happen and when they don't. In court, legitimacy came from bloodlines. Here it comes from data. That night, Jinshi sketches the outbreak timeline in dust on the floor. Not like a physician, like a strategist. He predicts the next flare-up. 2 days later, it happens. The survivors stare at him like he's cursed. Jinshi feels no pride, only dread. Understanding this system doesn't give him leverage. It gives him responsibility. Because once you see that suffering is scheduled, you can no longer pretend it's accidental. He wipes the dust away. Viruses can be cured. Systems fight back. And Jinshi knows which one is harder to survive. The safe zone had grown from a desperate huddle of survivors into something resembling order, and at the center of that transformation stood Jinshi, though he would never claim such a position aloud. 3 weeks had passed since the initial outbreak reached critical mass, and the warehouse district they'd fortified now housed 47 people, each one alive because of decisions made in rooms they'd never entered, through systems they barely understood they were part of. Jinshi moved through the space like water finding channels, his presence unremarkable until you realized how many conversations shifted when he approached, how many plans waited for his quiet input before moving forward. He'd started with the supply routes because that's where survival lived or died, not the dramatic last stands against the infected, but the mundane mathematics of canned goods and clean water. The first convoy Jinshi organized had been a disaster by most measures. They'd lost a vehicle and barely escaped with half their intended haul, but he'd watched, cataloged, learned. He noted which streets the infected frequented, which buildings still held resources, which survivors hoarded information about untapped locations. By the third run, his routes avoided the major hordes entirely, slipping through gaps in the undead tide that others didn't know existed. He never went on these runs himself. Instead, he spent hours with maps and eyewitness accounts, building a mental picture of the city's new topology, where danger pooled in predictable patterns and safety existed in the negative spaces between. The supply teams began reporting to him without anyone officially deciding that should happen. It started with Marcus, a former delivery driver who knew the city's loading docks, asking Jinshi's opinion on a potential route. Then Sarah, who'd survived by looting pharmacies, sharing her finds and asking what they needed most. Within a week, every team that left the warehouse checked with Jinshi first, and every team that returned found him waiting with questions that felt less like interrogation and more like genuine interest in their well-being. He remembered details, that Marcus's daughter needed her inhaler medication, that Sarah had mentioned her sister worked at a veterinary clinic that might have antibiotics. When supplies matching these needs appeared in their personal allocations, neither questioned the coincidence. They simply became more thorough in their reports to him, more willing to share information they'd previously kept to themselves. Information became Jinshi's true currency in this new world, not survival supplies themselves, but knowledge of where they could be found, who needed them most, and what people were willing to do to obtain them. He established what he called the evening briefings, informal gatherings where returning supply teams shared what they'd seen. Initially, these were chaotic affairs, everyone talking over each other, rumors spreading faster than facts, fear amplifying every distant groan into an imminent horde. Jinshi listened to the first 3 briefings without saying a word, his expression attentive but neutral. On the 4th evening, he began asking questions, simple ones at first. What time did you see them? How many exactly? Which direction were they moving? His questions imposed structure on chaos, transformed panic into data. Briefings evolved. People began organizing their thoughts before speaking, anticipating the questions Jinshi would ask. They brought observations instead of hysteria. The infected seemed more active at dusk. Certain streets were becoming impassable. A group of survivors in the East District was lighting signal fires. Jinshi absorbed it all, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal he'd acquired from somewhere, but mostly just listening with that perfect attention he'd cultivated in the imperial court. The attention that made people feel heard, valued, important. The attention that made them want to bring him more, better, more detailed information next time. But Jinshi didn't share everything he learned. This was the delicate part, the dangerous part, the part that would have gotten him killed in the palace if he'd miscalculated. He began controlling informatio. Enflow with the same precision he'd once controlled palace politics. When scouts reported a horde moving toward the East District survivors, Jinshi mentioned it only to the council, 3 people who'd naturally emerged as decision-makers through force of personality or useful skills. He presented it as something they should discuss privately before causing general panic. When those East District survivors went silent 3 days later, the council looked to Jinshi, who'd anticipated the danger, and he became the person they consulted before making announcements to the broader group. He built a network of information sources without anyone realizing they were being networked. There was Miguel, who maintained the radio equipment and monitored emergency frequencies. Jinshi spent an hour every morning with him, ostensibly checking for rescue broadcasts, but really learning which survivor groups were communicating, what they needed, who was desperate enough to make bad decisions. There was Jennifer, a former nurse who ran the medical bay and knew exactly who was injured, sick, or showing the stress fractures that preceded mental collapse. Jinshi brought her tea, a precious commodity he'd somehow acquired, and listened to her vent about supply shortages and difficult patients. She never noticed how his casual questions mapped the psychological state of their entire community. The younger survivors gravitated to him naturally, maybe because he looked barely older than some of them, maybe because he never spoke down or dismissed their fears as childish. Tommy was 17, scared, and convinced the military would rescue them any day. Jinshi let him maintain that hope while gently encouraging him to learn practical skills, how to reinforce barricades, how to move quietly, how to read the infected's movement patterns. Yuki was 19 and angry, furious at the government, at the infected, at their situation. Jinshi gave her productive outlets, leading scavenging teams, teaching others to fight. Both of them brought Jinshi information constantly, competing for his approval in ways they probably didn't consciously recognize. The council meeting where everything crystallized happened on a cold morning 4 weeks into their survival. They were discussing whether to make contact with another survivor group holed up in an office building 6 blocks away. The council was split. Some saw potential allies and resources, others saw competition and risk. The argument had been circling for 20 minutes when David, a former police officer who'd become their de facto security chief, turned to where Jinshi sat in the corner, technically not part of the council, but somehow always present at their meetings. "What do you think?" David asked, and the room went quiet. Jinshi took his time responding, letting the weight of their attention settle. "I think we need to know more about them first," he said carefully. "Miguel picked up their radio communications 3 days ago. They have 15 people, limited supplies, and they're discussing leaving the city entirely. If we contact them now, we're gambling. They might have skills or resources we need, but they're also desperate enough to be unpredictable. However, if we wait another week, monitor their communications, and approach them only after we understand their situation better, we can determine whether they're worth the risk." He paused, meeting each council member's eyes in turn. "I've already asked Miguel to prioritize monitoring their frequency. If you'd like, I can compile a report by this evening." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was contemplative. He'd given them a third option they hadn't considered, demonstrated he was already gathering the information they needed, and offered to do the analytical work they lacked time for. The council agreed to his proposal without debate. It was only later, when Jinshi was alone with his thoughts, that he recognized what had happened. They hadn't asked him to take charge, they'd simply stopped making decisions without him. The supply routes had expanded under his invisible guidance. Teams no longer just scavenged randomly. They followed priorities Jinshi established based on their dwindling stockpiles, upcoming needs, and risk assessment. When a team wanted to raid a pharmacy in a dangerous area, they came to him first, and he'd review the route, suggest alternatives, or, if the need was genuine, organize additional support. When supplies came in, distribution happened through a system Jinshi had designed, one that rewarded those who contributed to the community's survival, while ensuring even the weakest members received what they needed to stay alive. No one had appointed him quartermaster, but everyone checked with him before taking supplies beyond their daily rations. He'd created dependencies without coercion. Marcus's scavenging team was the most successful because Jinshi provided them with the best intelligence. Jennifer's me. Dickel Bay stayed stocked because Jinshi ensured medical supplies were prioritized. David's security patrols were most effective because Jinshi briefed them on infected movement patterns before each shift. None of them could do their jobs as well without Jinshi's contribution, and all of them knew it. It wasn't control through fear or force, it was control through indispensability. His court was forming again, though none of them would have called it that. There were the council members who made official decisions, but waited for Jinshi's analysis before committing. There were the information brokers like Miguel and Jennifer who fed him intelligence. There were the action takers like Marcus and David who implemented plans Jinshi shaped but never explicitly ordered. And there were the masses of survivors who simply trusted that someone was organizing things, that their safety was being managed by people who knew what they were doing, never realizing how much of that management flowed through one quiet man who'd never sought a title or position. The irony wasn't lost on Jinshi. He'd been removed from the imperial court, stripped of his position and purpose, sent away from the political machinations that had defined his existence. And here, in a world of undead horrors and survival horror, he'd rebuilt his court without even trying, because this was what he knew who he was. Give him a group of people and he'd find the power structures, the information flows, the dependencies and needs and fears that could be shaped into order. He'd do it instinctively, the way others breathed. But there was a difference this time, one Jinshi contemplated during the quiet hours when he updated his journal and planned the next day's operations. In the palace, he'd played political games because that was survival, manipulate or be manipulated, control or be controlled. Here, the games he played kept people alive in the most literal sense. The dependencies he created didn't serve his ambition, they served the community's survival. When he controlled information, it was to prevent panic and enable smart decisions, not to gain leverage over rivals. Was it still manipulation if the outcome was genuinely beneficial? Was it still a power game if everyone won? These questions troubled him in ways palace politics never had, because in the palace the answers had been clear. Everyone was playing the same game and the rules were understood. Here, most people weren't playing at all, they were just trying to survive. And Jinshi, unable to stop being who he was, had made himself essential to their survival by doing what came naturally to him. The evening briefing that night drew 20 people, twice as many as when they'd started. Jinshi stood at the center, not elevated above anyone, but positioned where everyone could see and hear him clearly. He guided the discussion with practiced ease, drawing out information, connecting disparate observations into useful intelligence, building a shared understanding of their situation. When it ended, people didn't disperse immediately. They lingered, asking him questions, seeking his opinion on small decisions, wanting just a moment of his attention. His court, gathering around him not because he demanded it, but because he'd made himself the person they needed him to be. Leadership had returned, just as he'd always known it would, not through force or declared authority, but through the slower, more permanent bonds of dependence and trust. In the Apothecary Diaries world, he'd been Jinshi the administrator, the beautiful face of imperial power. In the Resident Evil universe, he was becoming something else, the spider at the center of a web of survivors who didn't realize they'd been caught, or that being caught might be the only thing keeping them alive. Jinshi had known for 6 days that Robert Chen was going to betray him, and he'd spent those 6 days ensuring the betrayal would happen exactly as he needed it to. Chen was a communications specialist, 42 years old, former IT contractor who'd worked with military systems before the outbreak. He was competent, careful, and desperately afraid, not of the infected, but of being trapped in this slow-death survival scenario forever. Jinshi had watched that fear calcify into resolve during their evening briefings, had seen the way Chen's eyes lingered on the radio equipment, had noticed the precise moment when desperation transformed into decision. Most people would have confronted Chen, removed the threat, warned the others. Jinshi had simply adjusted his plans and waited for the inevitable. The umbrella contact had come through 3 weeks ago, a brief encrypted transmission that Miguel had intercepted and immediately brought to Jinshi rather than the council. It was a simple offer broadcast to any survivors with technical skills. Extraction in exchange for intelligence on infected behavior, survivor locations, and useful personnel. Miguel had wanted to. Nor it delete it, pretend they'd never heard it. Jinshi had told him to monitor the frequency but tell no one else. He'd known then that someone in their group would eventually respond. Fear and hope were powerful motivators, and Umbrella understood human nature as well as he did. He'd simply needed to identify who would break first and determine whether that breaking could serve his purposes. Chen had accessed the radio room alone 4 times in the past week, always during shifts when Miguel was elsewhere, always for durations that suggested more than equipment checks. Jinshi had made it easy for him, suggesting Miguel take breaks at predictable times, ensuring the radio room was empty during windows Chen could exploit, even providing Chen with information that would seem valuable to Umbrella. Chen thought he was being clever, thought his betrayal was secret. He didn't understand that Jinshi had been managing betrayals since before Chen learned to use a computer, that the imperial court had been a masterclass in anticipating treachery and turning it to advantage. The information Jinshi fed Chen through their regular briefings was carefully curated, details about their defenses that were already changing, intelligence about infected patterns that was accurate but incomplete, population counts that were slightly inflated, nothing that would immediately endanger their people, but everything that would make Chen seem credible to Umbrella while giving Jinshi control over what the corporation actually learned. It was a delicate balance, make Chen's intelligence valuable enough that Umbrella would act on it, but manipulate the context so their actions served Jinshi's purposes rather than their own. What Jinshi needed was contact with Umbrella on his terms, not theirs. He'd spent weeks analyzing everything they'd learned about the corporation, their tactics, their priorities, their willingness to sacrifice expendable assets while protecting valuable ones. Umbrella would come for Chen because they needed people who understood their systems, who could provide ongoing intelligence. But they wouldn't come in force, that would waste resources. They'd send a small extraction team, efficient and surgical. And if Jinshi positioned himself correctly, that extraction team would become his gateway to understanding Umbrella's larger operations, their weaknesses, their command structure. The council meeting where everything accelerated happened on a gray afternoon when rain hammered the warehouse roof with apocalyptic intensity. They were discussing expansion, whether to recruit the office building survivors they'd been monitoring. David advocated for it, arguing they needed numbers. Sarah worried about supplies. Jennifer raised concerns about disease vectors in a larger population. The debate was circular, unproductive, until Chen spoke up with uncharacteristic passion. "We need to think bigger than just surviving," Chen said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation he probably didn't intend to reveal. There are organizations out there with resources, with infrastructure. Maybe we should be trying to make contact, find evacuation routes instead of just hunkering down here forever." The room went quiet. It was Miguel who responded first, his tone carefully neutral. "What kind of organizations are you thinking about, Rob?" Chen faltered, realizing he'd revealed too much. "Just military, government, whoever's coordinating relief efforts. Someone must be organizing survivors on a larger scale." Jinshi watched the exchange from his usual position at the periphery, his expression thoughtful but not judgmental. He let the silence stretch just long enough before speaking. "Robert raises an interesting point," he said quietly, drawing every eye in the room. "We've been focused on immediate survival, but we should consider longer-term options. Miguel, have you picked up any organized communications? Government channels, military frequencies, anything suggesting coordinated rescue operations?" Miguel glanced at Jinshi, understanding the game they were playing even if he didn't know all its dimensions. Nothing reliable, mostly automated distress signals, a few survivor groups talking to each other, some encrypted military traffic, but it's fragmented. And, he hesitated, there was that corporate channel, the one offering extraction. Corporate. David's attention sharpened. "What corporation?" "I couldn't confirm the source," Miguel said, which was technically true, but the transmission pattern and encryption suggested private military contractors or pharmaceutical companies. They were offering extraction in exchange for intelligence. The room erupted in discussion. Some survivors saw hope, a way out. Others saw danger. Corporations like Umbrella had caused this mess. Chen stayed quiet, but Jinshi could see the panic in his eyes, the fear that his secret communication channel had been exposed. Jinshi let him suffer for a moment, Biff. "Or providing an escape route." "It's worth monitoring," Jinshi said, his voice cutting through the chaos with practiced ease. "We don't need to respond, but we should understand what options exist. Miguel, continue tracking those transmissions. If they seem legitimate, we can discuss making contact as a group, but let's not rush into anything that could compromise our security." The council agreed, and the meeting moved on to other topics. But Jinshi had accomplished what he needed. He'd normalized the idea of umbrella contact while appearing cautious, and he'd given Chen both relief and additional pressure. Chen would now feel safe continuing his communications, but he'd also feel urgency. If the group decided to make official contact, his private deal would be exposed, and his chance at extraction would vanish. Jinshi was betting that urgency would force Chen to accelerate his timeline, to push Umbrella for immediate extraction before the group's official contact happened. That night, Jinshi found Chen in the supply room, ostensibly doing inventory. He'd known Chen would be there. It was one of the few places with privacy, and Chen's stress was reaching critical mass. Jinshi entered quietly, picking up a clipboard and examining supply lists as if that was his only purpose. "You're worried," Jinshi said after a long silence, his tone conversational rather than accusatory. Chen jerked, nearly dropping the can he'd been holding. "About what?" "About whether we're making the right decisions. About whether survival here is sustainable long-term." Jinshi set down the clipboard and looked at Chen directly. "About whether there might be better options that we're not considering." For a moment, Chen looked like he might confess everything. Fear, guilt, and hope warred across his features, but then his expression hardened into something defensive. "We're all worried about that." "True," Jinshi agreed, "but some people handle worry by seeking alternatives. There's no shame in that, Robert. Wanting to survive, wanting something better than this, those are human responses." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If someone did make outside contact, established a potential extraction route, I wouldn't judge them for it. I want to understand what they'd learned, what options they'd discovered. Because information benefits everyone, even if the source is unconventional." Chen stared at him, trying to determine if this was a trap or an offer. Jinshi maintained his neutral expression, the one that had served him through countless palace intrigues. He was giving Chen rope. The question was whether Chen would use it to save himself or hang himself. "What if that information came with conditions?" Chen asked slowly. "What if the people offering extraction wanted something in return?" "Then we'd need to evaluate whether what they wanted was something we could afford to give," Jinshi replied. "Intelligence has value only in context. The infected population in this district, that's information Umbrella probably already has. The location of survivor groups, same. But internal dynamics, decision-making processes, specific individuals with valuable skills, that's information that could be shared selectively without compromising core security." He picked up the clipboard again, returning to the supply list as if this was just casual conversation. If someone were in communication with external parties, I'd hope they'd be smart about what they revealed, valuable enough to maintain the relationship, but not so valuable that it endangered everyone here. He left without waiting for a response, knowing he'd planted exactly the seeds he needed. Chen would interpret that conversation as tacit approval, or at least as evidence that Jinshi wouldn't interfere with his plans. More importantly, Jinshi had just given Chen a framework for what information to share, one that would make Chen seem more valuable to Umbrella while ensuring the truly dangerous intelligence stayed protected. Chen would think he was being clever, following Jinshi's unintentional guidance. He wouldn't realize he was being directed, that every piece of information he shared with Umbrella from this point forward would be information Jinshi wanted them to have. The extraction was scheduled for 3 nights later, though Jinshi wouldn't learn the specific timing until the day before. He'd positioned Miguel to intercept Chen's final transmission, not to stop it, but to ensure Jinshi knew exactly when Umbrella would arrive. The plan Chen had negotiated was predictable. An extraction team would come to a predetermined location, Chen would meet them with promised intelligence, and they'd extract him and potentially other valuable assets he'd identified. Chen had naturally mentioned Jinshi in his communications, the mysterious coordinator who seemed to run everything without official authority. Umbrella would be interested in that. They'd want to at least assess whether Jinshi was worth extracting alongside Chen. Jinshi spent those 3 days making final preparations. He briefed the security teams on new patrol routes that would conveniently leave certain areas less guarded. He organized a supply run that would take some of their most observant people out of the compound during the extraction window. He had a private conversation with Malmo, who'd grown increasingly sharp at reading both infected behavior and human deception, and asked her to stay in the medical bay that night, suggesting he had concerns about a security situation he needed to handle personally. She'd studied him with those calculating eyes and simply nodded, trusting that he knew what he was doing even if she didn't understand why. The night of the extraction was moonless and cold, the kind of darkness that made even the familiar territory feel alien. Jinshi watched from a second-story window as Chen slipped out of the compound at the arranged time, heading toward the old parking structure 3 blocks away. Jinshi waited 10 minutes, then followed a parallel route he'd scouted days earlier. He had no intention of stopping the extraction. He intended to observe it, to see how Umbrella operated, to potentially introduce himself on his own terms rather than as Chen's afterthought. The parking structure was a perfect extraction point, multiple exits, elevated position for overwatch structural cover from infected. Jinshi positioned himself in an adjacent building, finding a vantage point that gave him clear sight lines while keeping him hidden. Chen arrived first, nervous energy evident even from a distance. Then came the Umbrella team, 4 operatives in tactical gear, moving with military precision. They surrounded Chen quickly, professionally, one of them scanning him for weapons, while another deployed some kind of electronic device that Jinshi guessed was checking for tracking signals or recording equipment. The conversation was too distant to hear, but Jinshi could read body language. Chen was eager, desperate to prove his value. The Umbrella operatives were clinical, efficient, unmoved by Chen's obvious anxiety. One of them, the team leader based on how the others deferred, was reviewing something on a tablet, likely the intelligence Chen had provided. Then the leader asked something, and Chen pointed back toward their compound. Pointed and described, no doubt detailing their defenses, their population, their resources, and certainly mentioning Jinshi. The leader looked interested at whatever Chen said about him, spoke into a radio, gestured to the other operatives. 2 of them started prepping Chen for extraction, fitting him with gear, preparing to move. But the leader and 1 other operative didn't leave. They were staying, Jinshi realized, coming to assess the compound, to verify Chen's intelligence, and probably to locate this mysterious coordinator Chen had mentioned. Perfect. Jinshi slipped away before they finished with Chen, taking a route that would put him back in the compound before the Umbrella operatives arrived. He'd seen what he needed to see. Their numbers, their equipment, their operational style. They were competent but not exceptional, professional soldiers following corporate protocols. They'd approach the compound cautiously, try to infiltrate rather than announce themselves, gather intelligence before deciding whether to extract anyone else. They wouldn't expect to be anticipated, wouldn't imagine that the person they'd come to assess had orchestrated their arrival. Back in the compound, Jinshi made himself visible in exactly the right place, the radio room, where he appeared to be reviewing communication logs alone. He'd sent Miguel away on a fabricated errand, ensuring he'd be isolated when the Umbrella operatives arrived. He wanted them to find him like this, alone, accessible, apparently vulnerable. He wanted them to think they had the advantage of surprise. The operatives were good. Jinshi heard nothing as they infiltrated the compound through the route Chen had undoubtedly described. But he knew they were there because he designed the moment to happen exactly this way. He continued reviewing the logs, letting them observe him, letting them make their assessment. A young man, early 20s, physically unremarkable, apparently absorbed in paperwork, not an obvious threat, not someone who'd seem to require extreme caution. When the team leader finally entered the radio room, weapon lowered but ready, Jinshi looked up with carefully calibrated surprise. Not panic, not aggression, just mild surprise, as if he'd been caught doing something mildly embarrassing rather than something actually dangerous. "You're with Umbrella," Jinshi said, making it a statement rather than a question. He set down the communication log slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Chen told you about this place." The team leader studied him, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You're the coordinator, the one who runs things H." "There." "I don't run anything," Jinshi replied with a slight smile. "I just help organize information. It's what I'm good at." He gestured to the radio equipment, the maps on the walls, the intelligence summaries he'd deliberately left visible. "You're here to verify Chen's information and decide if there's anyone else worth extracting. I'm assuming I'm on your assessment list." The operative didn't confirm or deny, but his eyes were cataloging everything. Jinshi's calm demeanor, the sophisticated intelligence setup, the organizational systems evident even in this small room. "Chen said you basically run this survivor group without any official authority, that you control information and supply distribution, that everyone defers to your judgment." "Chen exaggerates," Jinshi said mildly, "but I do pay attention to details. For instance, I know he's been communicating with you for 8 days. I know he provided you with information about our defenses, our population, and our resources. I know you brought a 4-person team and left 2 operatives at the extraction point with Chen, while you and your partner came here to verify his intelligence and assess whether anyone else is worth the extraction resources." The silence that followed was profound. The operative's grip on his weapon tightened fractionally, his entire posture shifting from assessment to wariness. "You knew about Chen." "I facilitated Chen," Jinshi corrected gently. "He wanted extraction. You wanted intelligence. I needed to understand how Umbrella operates, what you value, and whether direct contact with your organization might be beneficial. Chen's betrayal served everyone's interests. You let him sell you out. I let him provide you with carefully selected information that would make him seem valuable while bringing you here under controlled circumstances." Jinshi leaned back in his chair, the picture of calm confidence. "If I wanted to stop Chen, I would have. If I'd wanted to avoid this contact, I would have. But I didn't because I wanted exactly this conversation. You're here to assess whether I'm worth extracting. I'm here to assess whether Umbrella is worth engaging with. We both have questions." "Why not ask them directly?" The operative studied him for a long moment, and Jinshi could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This wasn't what he'd expected. Most survivors were desperate, frightened, easily manipulated. This young man was none of those things. He'd anticipated the betrayal, controlled its parameters, and engineered a situation where Umbrella had walked directly into his hands while thinking they held the advantage. "What do you want?" the operative finally asked. "Information," Jinshi replied simply. "About Umbrella's operations, your evacuation criteria, where you're taking extracted personnel, and what your long-term objectives are in this region. In exchange, I can provide you with accurate intelligence about infected behavior patterns we've documented, verified survivor group locations and capabilities, an analysis of how the outbreak is evolving in this area. Real intelligence, not the curated version Chen gave you. And if we just extract you by force and get that information through interrogation." Jinshi's smile didn't waver. "Then you'd get whatever I chose to tell you under duress, which might or might not be accurate, and you'd lose the opportunity to establish a genuine intelligence asset in this region. I'm more valuable as a willing contact than as an extracted prisoner. You know that, or you wouldn't be having this conversation." The operative considered this, then spoke into his radio in a low voice. Jinshi caught only fragments: situation unusual, potential asset, requesting guidance. There was a longer pause, then a response Jinshi couldn't hear. The operative's expression shifted slightly, becoming more neutral, more professional. "My name is Captain Harris," he said, apparently having received authorization to proceed. "Umbrella Corporation Emergency Response Division. We're extracting valuable personnel and gathering intelligence on BOW behavior. What you call infected, we call bioorganic weapons, Umbrella's terminology for the engineered organisms causing this outbreak." "Engineered," Jinshi repeated, filing that confirmation away. Chen's intelligence had suggested it, but Harris had just verified that Umbrella had created these things deliberately. "That's useful to know. What else can you tell me?" What followed was a negotiation as delicate and complex as anything Jinshi had navigated in the Imperial Court. Harris was cautious but pragmatic. He recognized that Jinshi represented a potential ongoing intelligence source, and that was worth more than a simple extraction. Jinshi was measured but curious. He asked questions that demonstrated both his intelligence and his understanding of Umbrella's operational realities. They traded information carefully, each testing the other's reliability. Each establishing the parameters of a relationship that neither fully trusted, but both found potentially useful. By the time Harris and his partner left an hour later, Jinshi had learned about Umbrella's facility locations, their research priorities, and their evacuation hierarchy. Harris had learned about infected mutation patterns, survivor group dynamics, and territorial mapping that Umbrella's satellite surveillance had missed. Neither had revealed anything that would genuinely compromise their respective positions, but both had established enough value to justify future contact. Chen never came back. Jinshi learned later that he'd been extracted to an Umbrella facility, debriefed, and assigned to communications work for their emergency response division. Exactly what he'd wanted, bought with a betrayal that had served Jinshi's purposes more than his own. Miguel asked what happened to Chen, and Jinshi told him the truth. He made contact with Umbrella and secured extraction. I knew he would, and I made sure it happened in a way that didn't compromise our security. The others assumed Jinshi had been unaware until it was too late. Only Miguel understood that Jinshi had orchestrated the entire thing. The council meeting the next morning was subdued. David reported that Chen was missing and had likely been extracted by outside forces. Jennifer worried about security. Sarah questioned whether they could trust anyone. Jinshi let them process their fear and anger before speaking. "We should view this as intelligence gained rather than security lost," he said quietly. "We now know that Umbrella is actively extracting survivors, that they value technical specialists, and that they're willing to negotiate. We also know they're operating with limited resources, only 4 operatives for an extraction, which suggests they're stretched thin. This gives us leverage if we ever need to make official contact." "Did you know," David asked suddenly, his cop instincts making him more observant than the others, "about Chen?" Jinshi met his gaze steadily. "I suspected he might attempt outside contact. I made sure that if he did, the information he could provide wouldn't endanger anyone here. Was I wrong to wait and see rather than confront him on suspicion alone?" The room was quiet. Finally, David shook his head slowly. "No, you played it right. If you'd confronted him, he might have gotten desperate, done something more dangerous. This way, we know what we're dealing with." The meeting continued, but something had shifted. They looked at Jinshi differently now, not with fear exactly, but with a new understanding of how many steps ahead he was thinking, how carefully he was managing threats they didn't even see. His court had just learned that their quiet coordinator didn't avoid betrayals or try to prevent them through loyalty and trust. He anticipated them, controlled them, and weaponized them to serve his purposes. That night, Mao Mao found him on the roof where he'd gone to think. She sat beside him without speaking, her presence comfortable and undemanding. Finally, she said, "You knew about Chen from the beginning." "Yes." "You could have stopped him." "Yes." "But you didn't, because you wanted to make contact with Umbrella on your terms." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, processing. "That's terrifying, Jinshi. You let someone betray you, betray all of us, because it served a larger purpose you'd identified. Would you rather I stopped him and learned nothing, or let it happen randomly when I wasn't prepared?" He turned to look at her. Betrayal was coming. Someone was going to break eventually. I simply ensured that when it happened in a controlled way that gave us more than it cost us. And if you'd miscalculated, if Umbrella had sent more operatives, if they'd decided to raid us instead of negotiate, then I would have adapted, Jinshi said simply. But I didn't miscalculate because I spent weeks studying their patterns, their resource limitations, their operational priorities. I knew what they would do before they did it because that's what I do, Mao Mao. I read people, anticipate behavior, and position things so that outcomes serve my purposes. It's who I am. She looked at him for a long time and he couldn't quite read her expression. Fear, respect, something more complicated. The palace really did train you for this, didn't they? This whole apocalypse, it's just another court to you. Not quite, Jinshi replied, his voice softer. In the palace, I played games for power and position. Here, I play games for survival, mine and everyone else's. The skills are the same, but the stakes are different. Does that make it better or worse? Mao Mao didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. They sat together as night deepened around them, two people who understood manipulation and strategy in ways the others never would. And Jinshi knew that she, unlike the others, had just realized the full implicat. Ions of what he was, not a coordinator or organizer, but something more calculating and potentially more dangerous. A player who didn't avoid the game but mastered it so completely that even betrayal became just another piece to move across the board. The first betrayal had happened exactly as he'd planned. He'd allowed it, controlled it, and weaponized it. And now everyone, survivors and Umbrella alike, had learned a crucial lesson. Underestimating Jinshi was a mistake they wouldn't make twice. The message from Captain Harris arrived exactly 3 weeks after their first contact, transmitted on the encrypted frequency they'd established for ongoing intelligence exchanges. Jinshi sat alone in the radio room at 2 in the morning, the only time he could guarantee complete privacy, listening to Harris's voice crackle through the static with an offer that would have seemed like salvation to anyone else. "We've identified a potential immunity factor in certain survivors," Harris said, his tone professionally neutral in that way that suggested the information was anything but neutral. Umbrella's research division believes they can synthesize a treatment, not a cure, but protection against infection. They're looking for test subjects who have demonstrated leadership capabilities and strategic value. Your psychological profile suggests you'd be an ideal candidate for the advanced trial group. Extraction can be arranged within 48 hours. Jinshi listened to the entire message twice, his expression unchanging, before deleting it from the system. He sat in the darkness for a long time afterward, turning the offer over in his mind with the same analytical precision he applied to everything else. Immunity. Protection from the very thing that had turned their world into a nightmare of shambling corpses and survival horror. The chance to move through infected zones without fear, to rebuild without constantly looking over his shoulder for the next threat. And all he had to do was abandon the 47 people who depended on him and become a test subject for the corporation that had caused this catastrophe in the first place. The palace would have taught him to take the offer without hesitation. Survival of the fittest, preservation of the most valuable assets, the strong elevated while the weak were left to their fate. The imperial court had operated on those principles for centuries, and Jinshi had learned to navigate that ruthless calculus before he'd understood what it truly meant. Save yourself first, always. Secure your position, your power, your continued existence, because a dead martyr served no one and helped nothing. He could almost hear his tutor's voices in his head, explaining with perfect logic why accepting Umbrella's offer was the only rational choice. He was more valuable than the average survivor. His strategic mind, his organizational capabilities, his ability to read people and situations, these were rare resources worth preserving. What could he accomplish if he survived with immunity? How many more people could he help if he wasn't constantly at risk of infection himself? The arguments were compelling, logical, entirely reasonable, and Jinshi rejected them completely, though he couldn't entirely articulate why even to himself. He didn't mention Harris's offer at the morning briefing, where they discussed the usual concerns, supply routes, infected migration patterns, the ongoing debate about whether to make contact with the office building survivors. He didn't mention it during his afternoon conversation with Miguel, who was excited about improvements to their radio system. He didn't mention it when Jennifer pulled him aside to discuss a minor outbreak of food poisoning that had affected 3 people and required careful resource management to address. He simply continued his routines, managed his networks of information and dependence, and thought about immunity while pretending he wasn't thinking about it at all. Mamo noticed first because of course she did. She found him in the supply room that evening, ostensibly reviewing inventory but actually just standing there staring at crates of canned goods without seeing them. She didn't ask what was wrong, that wasn't her style. She simply started checking medical supplies beside him, her presence companionable and undemanding, waiting for him to speak if he chose to. "If you could be immune to the infection," Jinshi said eventually, his voice quiet enough that it almost disappeared into the ambient sounds of the warehouse. "But the price was leaving everyone here behind. Would you take it?" Mao Mao's hands stilled on the bandage box she'd been counting. "That's oddly specific." "Hypothetically." "No, you don't do hypotheticals unless they're actually happening." She turned to look at him directly, her expression sharp with concern. "What did Umbrella offer you?" Jinshi told her, keeping his voice clinical and detached as he detailed Harris's message. Immunity research, advanced trial group, extraction, protection at the cost of abandoning his court, though he didn't use that word with her, calling them instead the people here, as if that made the choice less loaded with palace politics and power dynamics he was trying to escape. When he finished, Mao Mao was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something he didn't expect. "You're terrified you might actually want to take it." The accuracy of that observation hit harder than it should. "Ave, I don't want to take it," Jinshi replied, but his voice lacked the conviction he'd intended. "But you're thinking about it, calculating the outcomes, weighing the costs and benefits, trying to determine if there's a logical argument that makes abandoning everyone here the correct choice." Mao Mao set down the bandages and crossed her arms, studying him with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "You're trying to figure out if refusing makes you noble or just stupid." "Is there a difference?" "In outcome, probably not. You'd be equally dead either way." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But you're asking the wrong question, Jinshi. It's not about nobility or stupidity. It's about what kind of person you're choosing to be now that the palace rules don't apply anymore." That cut closer to the truth than Jinshi wanted to acknowledge. He'd been raised in a system where survival meant hierarchy, where value was determined by utility and position, where sacrificing the weak to preserve the strong was not just accepted but expected. The palace had taught him that his life was worth more than others, because of what he could accomplish, who he was, the blood that ran in his veins, even if no one could publicly acknowledge it. And some part of him, the part shaped by years of palace education and political necessity, still believed that, still calculated his own value against others, and came up with numbers that suggested taking Umbrella's offer was the rational choice. But there was another part, newer, less certain, forged in these weeks of survival where titles meant nothing and everyone depended on everyone else, that recoiled from that calculation with something approaching horror. "I can't take it," Jinshi said finally, though the words felt like they were being pulled from somewhere deep and uncomfortable. "Even if it's the logical choice, even if I could theoretically help more people by surviving, I can't. Because the moment I accept immunity at the cost of leaving others behind, I become exactly what I've been pretending not to be. I become the palace again. I become the system that measures lives in terms of value and utility, and decides who deserves to survive based on strategic importance." "So you refuse because of principle?" Mao Mao asked, and her tone suggested she was testing the statement rather than accepting it. "I refuse because accepting would turn me into something I don't want to be," Jinshi corrected. "It's not nobility, Mao Mao. It's self-preservation of a different kind. If I take that offer, I might survive the infection, but I lose something else. Something I didn't even know I valued until Umbrella tried to put a price on it." Mao Mao nodded slowly, seeming to accept this answer even if she didn't entirely understand it. "You're going to tell Harris no?" "I'm going to ignore the offer entirely," Jinshi replied. "Telling him no opens a negotiation. They'll ask why, what would change my mind, what price would make me reconsider. Ignoring it sends a clearer message. This isn't something I'm willing to discuss." She left him alone after that, but Jinshi could tell she was worried. Not about his decision necessarily, but about what it meant, what it cost him to refuse something that his entire upbringing had taught him to take without hesitation. He was worried about the same thing if he was honest with himself. Was he making a principled choice or just being self-destructive? Was refusing the cure an act of integrity or an act of elaborate suicide dressed up in moral reasoning? The answer came 3 days later in a way Jinshi didn't expect. Harris sent a follow-up message, more detailed this time, and Jinshi made the mistake of listening to it during an evening when Miguel was in the radio room working on equipment maintenance. He could have waited, should have waited, but some part of him wanted a witness, wanted someone else to hear what Umbrella was really offering so he wouldn't have to carry the knowledge alone. The immunity research requires specific parameters, Harris's voice explained with clinical detachment. Test subjects need to demonstrate pre-existing partial resistance, exposure without infection, or infection followed by spontaneous recovery. We've identified 3 individuals in your compound who show these markers: the woman called Mao, the teenager named Yuki, and yourself. All 3 of you have had documented close contact exposure without showing infection symptoms. Umbrella is prepared to extract all 3, provide full immunity treatment, and guarantee survival. The offer extends beyond just you now. Bring the others, save yourself and them. The rest of your group's survival is a statistical improbability regardless of your presence. You can't save everyone, but you can save those who matter most. Miguel had stopped working, his hands frozen on the radio equipment, his expression caught somewhere between horror and disgust. They're telling you to choose, H. E said quietly, to decide who lives and who dies, to become God and play favorites. Jinshi deleted the message, his movements sharp with something that might have been anger. They're offering me a way to save Mao and Yuki, to preserve the people who have become. He stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. Important, valuable, the ones he'd miss if they died. All of those were true, but they all reduced human lives to calculations of personal attachment, which was exactly what Umbrella wanted him to do. Are you going to tell them? Miguel asked. Mao and Yuki. No. Why not? Shouldn't they get to make their own choices? Jinshi turned to look at Miguel, and the younger man actually flinched at whatever he saw in Jinshi's expression. Because the moment I tell them, I become complicit in Umbrella's game. I become the person who sorts survivors into categories of worthy and unworthy, who decides that some lives deserve protection while others don't. That's not a choice I'm willing to make for anyone, including them. But what if they'd want to go? What if Yuki would take immunity to survive? What if Mao? Then they'll have to discover that option on their own, Jinshi interrupted, his voice harder than he'd intended. I won't be the one to dangle survival in front of them at the cost of 44 other lives. I won't be the mechanism through which Umbrella divides us into deserving and expendable. That's the game, Miguel. That's what they're really testing with this offer. Not just whether I'll save myself, but whether I'll participate in the hierarchy they're trying to rebuild. Whether I'll accept their premise that some people are worth more than others. Miguel was quiet for a long time, processing. Finally, he said, "The palace really fucked you up, didn't it?" The observation was so blunt, so unexpectedly accurate, that Jinshi actually laughed, a short, sharp sound without much humor. The palace taught me exactly how this works, how people with power divide the world into valuable assets and acceptable losses, how survival becomes about position and utility rather than humanity. I spent my entire life learning to navigate that system, and I was good at it, Miguel. I was very good at it, and that's exactly why I can't take this offer. Because I know where it leads. I know what I become if I start making those calculations again. 3 days later, Harris sent a final message, and this one was different. No more clinical detachment, no more corporate neutrality. His voice carried an edge of something that might have been respect or might have been frustration. Your silence is noted and interpreted as refusal. I need you to understand what you're turning down. The immunity treatment is limited. We have resources for maybe 24 test subjects worldwide. You're one of them, so are 2 of your people. This isn't an offer we make lightly or frequently. This is survival, not just for you but for the human race. We need people like you, strategic thinkers, natural leaders, people who can help rebuild. And we need the immunity research to continue, which requires test subjects who show pre-existing resistance markers. You're refusing to participate in the very research that could save millions because you've decided to die on principle with people who are statistically doomed anyway. I want you to think about whether that's really the choice you want to make. Jinshi listened to the entire message, then deleted it like he had the others. But this time, he composed a response, something he hadn't done before. He kept it brief, stripping away all the emotional complexity and reducing it to the simple truth he'd arrived at after days of wrestling with the question. Captain Harris, I appreciate the offer and understand its value. I also understand what accepting it would require, not just abandoning my current group, but accepting Umbrella's premise that human lives can be divided into categories of worth based on utility and potential. I reject that premise, not because I'm noble or suicidal, but because that kind of thinking is what created this situation in the first place. Umbrella decided some research was worth the risk of global catastrophe. You're now deciding some people are worth saving while others aren't. Both decisions assume the right to value human life on a scale of importance. I won't participate in that calculation. If immunity research requires sorting people into worthy and expendable, then the research itself is as dangerous as the infection it's trying to prevent. Because a cure that creates gods who decide who lives and dies isn't a cure, it's just a different kind of infection. Good luck with your research. I hope you find test subjects who don't understand what they're really agreeing to. I understand perfectly, and my answer is no. He sent the message before he could reconsider, before the part of him that had been trained in palace survival could argue him out of it. Miguel witnessed the whole thing, and when it was done, he just nodded slowly. That's going to piss them off. Probably, Jinshi agreed, but at least they'll stop offering. The council meeting that evening was routine, supply discussions, security updates, the usual concerns of survival. But afterward, David pulled Jinshi aside with an expression that suggested he'd heard something, learned something, figured something out. A couple of people have been asking me if there are extraction opportunities with outside groups, David said carefully, specifically asking about Umbrella, about whether anyone's been offered extraction. I told them I didn't know anything about that, but I wanted to check with you. Are people being offered ways out? Jinshi could have lied, should have lied, probably, but he was tired of the deception, tired of the calculations, tired of being the person who controlled information and managed truths like a palace courtier. Umbrella offered me immunity research participation, extraction and protection from infection in exchange for becoming a test subject. I refused. David stared at him. You refused immunity. I refused to participate in research that requires me to accept that my life is worth more than everyone else's here. That's what they were really offering, not just survival, but validation of a hierarchy where some people deserve protection and others don't. I'm not interested in that world, even if refusing means I die in this one. Jesus, Jinshi. David ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling with the information. That's insane. You could have been immune. You could have survived this without fear, and you just said no. I said no to becoming the kind of person who accepts immunity at the cost of everyone else's expendability, Jinshi corrected quietly. There's a difference. David looked at him for a long moment, and Jinshi couldn't quite read his expression. Then the former cop did something unexpected. He extended his hand. I don't know if you're the bravest person I've ever met or the dumbest, but I'm glad you're here. And I'm glad you're the one making these decisions, because I don't think anyone else would have refused. Jinshi shook his hand, accepting the acknowledgement even though it felt uncomfortable, undeserved. He wasn't brave. He was just trying not to become the monster the palace had trained him to be, trying to draw a line somewhere that meant something even if he couldn't entirely explain why it mattered. That night he found himself on the roof again, seeking the solitude and perspective that came with height and distance. Mau joined him without invitation, settling beside him with the comfortable silence they'd developed over weeks of survival and shared understanding. David told me about the immunity offer, she said eventually, about how you refused it. I knew he would. He also told me there were 3 people in our group who qualified, you, me, and Yuki. She paused, letting that information settle between them. You didn't tell us. You made the decision for all of us. Yes, Jinshi didn't apologize, didn't justify, just acknowledged the truth of what he'd done. I understand why, Mau continued, her voice thoughtful rather than accusatory. You didn't want to be the person who offered salvation to some while leaving others behind. You didn't want to create a hierarchy of deserving and undeserving survivors. But Jinshi, we had a right to know, to make our own choices about our own lives. You're right, Jinshi agreed. I took that choice away from you. I justified it by telling myself I was protecting you from an impossible decision, but really I was protecting myself from having to watch you make it, from having to see whether you'd choose immunity or solidarity, and having to live with either answer. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Mau asked, if I'd known, if you'd told me, what do you think I would have chosen? Jinshi turned to look at her, really look at her. This woman who'd proven herself as much a survivor and strategist as he was, who'd navigated court politics and now navigated apocalypse with the same sharp intelligence. I don't know, he admitted, and that terrified me, because if you'd chosen immunity, I would have lost respect for you, and if you'd chosen to stay, I would have felt responsible for your death when it eventually comes. Either way, I'd lose something I've come to value. So I made the choice for you and told myself it was about principle when really it was about cowardice. That's probably the most honest thing you've ever said to me, Mamo observed. Then, surprising him, she smiled slightly. For what it's worth, I would have stayed, not because I'm noble or because I value the group over my own survival, but because immunity at the cost of becoming Umbrella's test subject means giving up control over my own fate. I'd rather die making my own choices than survive. On their terms, so you didn't take that from me. You just saved me from having to argue with Yuki about it, because she probably would have wanted to go. Jinshi felt something release in his chest, tension he hadn't entirely acknowledged until it eased. Thank you for saying that, even if it's not entirely true. It is true, Mamo insisted. You're not the only one who learned to read people and situations in the palace, Jinshi. I know what Umbrella is, what they're building. They're not trying to save humanity. They're trying to create a new hierarchy with themselves at the top and immunity as the currency of power. Anyone who takes their offer becomes part of that system, becomes complicit in the world they're building. I don't want to live in that world, even if refusing means I don't live at all. They stayed on the roof until dawn, not talking much, just existing in shared space and shared understanding. When the sun finally rose over their makeshift fortress of survivors and scavenged resources, Jinshi felt something he hadn't felt since before the outbreak, a sense of rightness, of having made a choice that aligned with something deeper than survival instinct or strategic calculation. He'd refused the cure, refused immunity, refused to participate in the creation of gods who decided who deserved to survive based on utility and value. And in refusing, he'd drawn a line that separated him from the palace, from Umbrella, from every system that had tried to teach him that some lives mattered more than others. Was it the right choice? He didn't know. Would he survive? Probably not. The statistics were clear, and without immunity, infection was always one bite, one scratch, one moment of carelessness away. But he'd made the choices himself, not as the palace had trained him to be, and that somehow mattered more than survival. Harris sent one final message a week later, brief and without the clinical detachment of earlier communications. Your refusal is noted and respected, even if not understood. The offer remains open indefinitely should you reconsider, but I suspect you won't. Good luck, Jinshi. You're going to need it more than most. Jinshi deleted the message and continued with the day's work, organizing supply routes, managing information networks, holding together a court of survivors who didn't know they were a court. He did it without the promise of immunity, without the protection Umbrella had offered, without any assurance that his choices would lead to anything but his own eventual infection and death. But he did it as himself, not as the palace had made him, not as Umbrella wanted him to be. Just as Jinshi, a man who'd chosen to refuse godhood even if it meant dying human. And somehow, in this world of infection and horror and impossible choices, that felt like the only victory that actually mattered. The first execution Jinshi witnessed happened on a Tuesday morning while he was coordinating a supply run to a pharmacy 3 blocks from their compound. He'd positioned himself on a rooftop with binoculars, his usual practice when teams ventured into dangerous territory, tracking their progress and watching for infected movement patterns. The pharmacy team had just secured their entry point when the Umbrella transport arrived, a heavily armored vehicle that moved with the smooth efficiency of corporate logistics rather than desperate survival. Jinshi adjusted his binoculars, curious about what would draw Umbrella resources to this particular location, and watched as 6 operatives in tactical gear deployed with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this hundreds of times before. They weren't hunting infected, they were hunting survivors. The family had been holed up in the apartment building adjacent to the pharmacy for weeks, based on the fortifications Jinshi had noted during his previous surveillance of the area. A father, mother, and 2 children. He'd seen them briefly during an earlier scouting mission, cautious faces appearing in windows before disappearing back into their fortress. They'd survived through careful isolation, avoiding contact with both infected and other survivors, rationing whatever supplies they'd stockpiled before the outbreak reached critical mass. They were doing everything right, everything the survival manuals would recommend, and Umbrella was about to kill them anyway. The operatives breached the apartment building with textbook precision, shaped charges on the reinforced door, flashbangs to disorient tactical entry with overlapping fields of fire. Jinshi heard the screams even from 3 blocks away, thin and desperate sounds that cut through the ambient groans of distant infected. The The family tried to run. He watched through his binoculars as they emerged from a side exit, the father carrying the younger child, the mother dragging the older one behind her. They made it perhaps 20 meters before the umbrella operatives executed them with the clinical efficiency of people processing paperwork. Single shots, center mass, professional spacing to ensure clean kill zones without crossfire risk. The father went down first, still clutching his daughter. The mother died trying to shield her son. The children were last, small bodies crumpling beside their parents, and Jinshi watched it all happen with the binoculars pressed so hard against his face that they left marks around his eyes. The entire execution took less than 90 seconds from breach to final shot. Then the operatives were scanning the perimeter, checking for witnesses, speaking into radios in calm voices that suggested they were reporting completion of a routine task. One of them produced a tablet, typing something with his free hand while his weapon stayed ready in the other. Filing a report, Jinshi realized with distant horror, documenting the execution for corporate records, checking off a box on some form that transformed murder into administrative completion. Another operative was already spraying something on the bodies, an accelerant, Jinshi guessed, though he couldn't be certain from this distance. Within minutes, the family was burning, smoke rising in a thin column that would attract infected from blocks away, eliminating evidence, destroying potential infection vectors, cleaning up loose ends. Standard operating procedure. The umbrella team extracted before the infected arrived, their vehicle disappearing back toward whatever facility they'd come from, leaving behind nothing but ashes and the growing crowd of undead drawn by the smoke and noise. Jinshi's supply team had frozen during the execution, pressed against the pharmacy wall, too terrified to move. He waited until the umbrella transport was completely gone before signaling them to abort the mission and return to the compound. They made it back shaken but alive, and when they asked him what they'd witnessed, Jinshi told them the truth. Umbrella doesn't rescue survivors, they process them. The council meeting that afternoon was the first time Jinshi had seen genuine fear in David's eyes. Not fear of infected or starvation, or any of the immediate survival threats they'd grown accustomed to, but fear of humans who killed with authorization forms and tactical precision. Why? David kept asking, his cop instincts unable to process execution without cause. Why kill them? They weren't infected, they weren't a threat, they were just a family trying to survive. What possible reason? Containment protocol, Jinshi interrupted quietly. He'd been thinking about this since the execution, turning it over in his mind with the same analytical detachment he applied to everything else, trying to understand the logic that would make this make sense to the people who'd ordered it. Umbrella isn't trying to save everyone. They're trying to control the outbreak narrative, manage the survival parameters, and eliminate variables that don't fit their operational objectives. That family was isolated, unreachable, and outside their administrative structure. They couldn't be extracted, couldn't be utilized, and couldn't be controlled, so they were eliminated before they could become a complication. That's not containment, Jennifer said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. That's murder, systematic murder dressed up in corporate language. Yes, Jinshi agreed simply, but murder with authorization, which makes it policy rather than crime in Umbrella's operational framework. Someone signed off on that execution. Multiple someones, probably field operative, mission commander, regional director. It went through approval chains and resource allocation. It was budgeted, scheduled, and executed according to standard operating procedures. That's what makes it monstrous. Not the killing itself, but the bureaucracy that transforms killing into paperwork. The room went quiet, everyone processing this new understanding of what they were really facing. The infected were dangerous, but they were comprehensible, mindless predators following biological imperatives. Umbrella was something else entirely. Thinking, planning, authorized evil that killed with the same casual efficiency most people used to file tax returns. Marcus, who'd been quiet until now, asked the question Jinshi had been waiting for. How many others? How many executions like this are happening? I don't know, Jinshi admitted, but based on the operational efficiency we witnessed, this wasn't their first. That team had done this before, probably many times. They knew exactly how to breach, how to execute, how to destroy evidence. That kind of precision comes from repetition, from practice, from doing the same thing over and over until it becomes routine. He didn't tell them about the second execution he'd witnessed 3 days later, or the third one the week after that. Didn't tell them he'd started tracking Umbrella movements specifically to document these killings, mapping them like He'd once mapped palace intrigues, trying to understand the pattern and logic that determined who lived and who got processed. He kept that investigation private, shared only with Mao Mao because she'd understand the necessity without questioning his methods or motivations. The pattern that emerged was worse than random violence. Umbrella wasn't just eliminating infected or dangerous survivors. They were systematically processing anyone who fell outside their administrative control. Isolated families like the first one he'd witnessed, small survivor groups who refused extraction or contact, individuals with useful skills who wouldn't cooperate with Umbrella's recruitment efforts. Anyone who represented an uncontrolled variable in their outbreak management strategy. The executions were scheduled, coordinated, and documented with the same careful attention to detail that corporations applied to quarterly earnings reports. Jinshi started keeping records in his leather journal, the same one he'd used to track supply routes and infected patterns. Now it contained execution logs, dates, times, locations, number of casualties, operational procedures observed. Each entry was clinical, detached, stripped of emotion because emotion would make the documentation impossible. He wrote about the family of 4 in apartment 7B, executed for the crime of surviving outside Umbrella's control. About the 3 teenagers who'd fortified a convenience store and died when they refused extraction. About the elderly couple who were killed simply because their building was scheduled for demolition to create a clear fire zone. Mao found the journal during one of her medical bay visits, left open on the table where Jinshi had been working. She read 3 pages before he returned and found her there, her expression caught somewhere between horror and resignation. "You're documenting their kills," she said, not quite a question. "Someone should," Jinshi replied. He didn't try to take the journal back, didn't apologize for leaving it where she could find it. Maybe part of him had wanted someone else to know, to share the weight of this knowledge that sat heavy in his chest like stones. Umbrella is treating this outbreak like a corporate restructuring. These executions aren't aberrations or field operative mistakes. They're policy, implemented with authorization and documentation. Someone needs to record that. Someone needs to remember these people existed and were murdered by policy rather than infection. "And then what?" Mao asked, gesturing at the journal. "What do you do with this information? Report it to some authority that no longer exists. Build a legal case for a justice system that's been eaten by zombies. This is just torture, Jinshi. Documenting horror you can't stop." "Maybe," he acknowledged, "but the alternative is letting Umbrella write the only history that survives this outbreak. Letting them control the narrative completely, decide who gets remembered and who gets erased from the record. I won't give them that. Even if this journal never reaches anyone, even if it burns with me when I eventually die, at least for now there's a record that tells the truth about what they're doing." The documentation became obsessive in ways Jinshi recognized as unhealthy but couldn't seem to stop. He started monitoring Umbrella frequencies more closely, tracking their operational dispatches, learning their codes and protocols. He positioned himself to witness their activities whenever possible, using the same skills he'd once applied to palace intelligence gathering to map corporate atrocities. Miguel worried about him. Jennifer suggested he was taking unnecessary risks, but Jinshi couldn't stop. Because every execution he witnessed and documented was one Umbrella couldn't pretend had never happened, one victim they couldn't erase from history completely. The execution that broke something in him happened 5 weeks after the first one, in an office building that had housed 23 survivors who'd organized themselves into a functional community. They'd been successful, too successful probably. They'd established supply chains, secured their perimeter, even begun growing food in a rooftop garden. They'd done everything right, created a model of survival that proved humans could adapt and thrive even in these conditions. And that made them dangerous to Umbrella's narrative that only corporate intervention could save humanity. The Umbrella team that arrived was larger than usual, 12 operatives instead of the standard 6. They brought specialized equipment, shaped charges for multiple breaches, even what looked like a portable crematorium for mass disposal. This wasn't an execution, it was an operation, planned and resourced like a military assault. Jinshi watched from his usual observation position, journal open, pen ready to document another atrocity. He told himself he'd become numb to this, that he could witness the killing. With the detached professionalism of someone recording historical facts. He was wrong. The office building survivors fought back. They'd prepared for infected attacks, built defenses and weapons and coordinated response plans. But they hadn't prepared for Umbrella, hadn't anticipated that the greater threat would come from organized humans rather than mindless undead. The breach happened simultaneously on 3 floors, coordinated, overwhelming, textbook tactical assault. The survivors tried to resist, tried to fall back to defensible positions, but Umbrella had planned for that. They'd mapped the building, identified choke points, positioned operatives to cut off retreat routes before the first shot was fired. The executions took 11 minutes from breach to completion. 23 people, killed with the efficient brutality of people who'd been authorized to solve a problem and had chosen the most direct solution. Jinshi watched it all happen, pen frozen over his journal, unable to write because his hands were shaking too badly. He watched parents die trying to shield children. Watched wounded survivors begging for mercy being executed anyway because mercy wasn't part of the authorized operational parameters. Watched the Umbrella team leader consulting his tablet between kills, checking names against some list, ensuring they'd processed every target on their assignment. When it was over, the operatives didn't leave immediately. They spent 20 minutes searching the building, cataloging supplies, marking useful equipment for later retrieval. One of them actually ate lunch, sitting on a desk beside the bodies, consuming a sandwich with the casual indifference of someone on a routine break. Another was joking with his teammate, their laughter carrying across the distance to where Jinshi crouched on his observation rooftop, feeling like he might vomit or scream or both. The portable crematorium processed the bodies efficiently, reducing 23 lives to ash and the faint smell of burning meat that drifted across the ruins. The Umbrella team loaded their marked supplies, filed their completion reports, and extracted with the same professional efficiency they displayed during the execution. By the time Jinshi finally moved from his position, his legs cramping from hours of immobility, there was nothing left to indicate 23 people had been alive that morning. Just another empty building in a city of empty buildings, another group of survivors erased from existence with nothing but a corporate report to mark their passing. Jinshi returned to the compound in silence, moving through his usual routines with mechanical precision while something screamed inside his chest. He filed his supply reports, attended the evening briefing, managed the small crises and questions that always emerged. He did everything expected of him while replaying the executions in his mind, watching over and over as people died not to infection or accident, but to policy, to authorization, to someone's calculated decision that these particular lives weren't worth the administrative complication of preserving them. It was David who eventually cornered him in the radio room, late that night when Jinshi was pretending to review communications logs, but really just sitting in the dark trying to process what he'd witnessed. "You saw something today," David said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Something worse than usual." Jinshi told him everything, about the office building survivors, about the coordinated assault, about the 11 minutes of systematic execution, and the 20 minutes of casual supply cataloging that followed, about the operative eating lunch beside the bodies, about the jokes and laughter, about the portable crematorium that reduced people to ash with industrial efficiency, about the complete absence of hesitation or remorse or human recognition in any of it. Just professionals doing their jobs, following their orders, implementing policy with the casual indifference of people who'd learned to see humans as resource allocation problems. "They're not soldiers," Jinshi said, his voice flat with the kind of calm that came after horror had exhausted all emotional capacity. "Soldiers kill enemies in war, and war has rules even if they're often broken. These are administrators with guns, bureaucrats with body counts, people who have learned to transform murder into paperwork so effectively that they can eat lunch beside corpses without experiencing cognitive dissonance. They're monsters, David. But they're monsters who file reports and get authorization and follow protocols. They're monsters with clearance." David was quiet for a long time, processing. Finally, he said, "This is what you've been tracking. All those observations, all that time spent monitoring Umbrella movements, you've been documenting executions." "Yes." "How many?" 47 confirmed, Jinshi replied, and saying the number out loud made it worse somehow, made the scale of the atrocity more real. 47 separate incidents, ranging from individual executions to today's mass killing. 163 total casualties that I've been able to document, and those are just the ones I've witnessed or confirmed through communications intercepts. The actual number is probably much higher. Jesus Christ, David ran his hand through his hair, A gesture Jinshi had learned meant he was trying to process something that exceeded his capacity to understand. They're killing more people than the infected are at this point. In this region, yes, the infected are dangerous, but they're predictable. They cluster in certain areas, follow certain patterns, can be avoided with careful planning. Umbrella is actively hunting survivors, systematically eliminating anyone who exists outside their control structure. They're the greater threat now, and most people don't even know it because they're still thinking of Umbrella as potential rescuers rather than authorized executioners. The council meeting the next morning was the hardest conversation Jinshi had ever orchestrated. He presented his documentation clinically, walking them through his observations and evidence without editorializing or allowing emotion to color the facts. He showed them the pattern, how Umbrella targeted successful survivor groups, how they eliminated individuals with useful skills who refused recruitment, how they processed anyone who represented an administrative complication to their outbreak management strategy. He explained the authorization chains, the operational procedures, the casual efficiency that transformed murder into routine corporate activity. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Jennifer was crying quietly, Marcus looked like he might be sick, Sarah had gone pale with understanding. Finally, it was Miguel who spoke, his voice small and uncertain. What do we do? We survive, Jinshi replied, and we make sure Umbrella sees us as more valuable alive than dead. That office building group failed because they were independent and successful. They proved humans could survive without corporate intervention, which threatened Umbrella's narrative. We need to appear dependent, controllable, not significant enough to warrant the resources of an execution operation. We need to be a known quantity that Umbrella has decided to leave alone, at least for now. So we make ourselves small, David said, understanding the strategy. Keep our heads down, avoid drawing attention, play the game of being harmless survivors rather than organized resistance. Exactly, it's not heroic, it's not satisfying, but it's survival. Jinshi looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. I know this isn't what you want to hear. You want me to say we'll fight back, that we'll expose Umbrella's crimes, that we'll be heroes who bring them to justice. But we're 47 people in a city of infected and corporate executioners. We don't have the resources for heroism. We have the resources for survival, and barely that. So we survive by being strategically invisible until we can find a way to be something else. The meeting ended with reluctant agreement, but Jinshi could see the shift in how people looked at him now. He wasn't just their coordinator anymore. He was the person who documented horrors they couldn't face directly, who'd made himself witness to atrocities for reasons they couldn't fully understand. Some of them seemed grateful for that burden being carried by someone else. Others seemed disturbed that he could observe such things and maintain his clinical detachment. All of them seemed to realize that Jinshi understood Umbrella in ways that made him simultaneously valuable and unsettling. That night, Mau found him on the roof again, his usual refuge when the weight of knowledge became too heavy to carry inside the compound's walls. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside him and looked out at the city, a sprawl of dark buildings where infected, shambled, and Umbrella operatives processed unauthorized survivors, and the distinction between monsters and administrators had become impossible to parse. You're carrying too much, she finally said. All that documentation, all those witnessed executions, you're trying to bear witness to every atrocity, and it's destroying you. Someone has to remember them, Jinshi replied, his voice empty of the conviction that statement should have carried. If I don't document it, they just disappear. Umbrella erases them completely, and it's like they never existed at all. But what's it costing you? Your humanity, your ability to feel anything except clinical detachment. She turned to look at him directly. Jinshi, you watched 23 people get executed yesterday, and you're talking about it like it's a supply logistics problem. That's not healthy. That's not sustainable. That's you becoming the same kind of Mo. Enster you're documenting, just with different authorization. The accuracy of that observation hit like a physical blow, because she was right. He had become something monstrous in his own way, someone who could watch executions and take notes, who could document atrocities with the same detached professionalism Umbrella operatives used to implement them. He'd told himself it was necessary, that someone needed to maintain the historical record, that bearing witness was an act of resistance against erasure. But really, he'd just found a way to transform horror into data, to process trauma through the same bureaucratic mechanisms that made Umbrella's atrocities possible. I don't know how else to do this, Jinshi admitted, and the vulnerability in his voice surprised him. I don't know how to witness these things and remain human, so I document them, turn them into facts and figures, make them comprehensible through clinical analysis. Because if I let myself feel it, if I let myself experience the full horror of what I'm watching, I'll break. And I can't break, Mau. These people need me functional, not traumatized. These people need you human, she corrected gently. Not functional despite trauma, but actually human. Someone who feels horror at executions instead of just documenting them. Someone who gets angry instead of just strategic. Someone who's trying to survive with their humanity, intact rather than surviving by discarding everything human about themselves. They stayed on the roof until dawn, and somewhere during those hours, Jinshi made a decision. He would continue documenting Umbrella's executions because that record mattered, because someone needed to remember the people being erased by corporate policy. But he would also let himself feel it, the horror, the anger, the grief for people he'd never met but had watched die. He would be human and functional, traumatized and strategic, broken and effective all at once. Because the alternative, becoming the clinical, detached administrator who processed atrocities like paperwork, would make him too much like the monsters he was documenting. The monsters didn't need claws or fangs or viral infection. They just needed authorization, operational protocols, and the ability to transform murder into administrative completion. They needed the capacity to see humans as resource allocation problems and executions as standard operating procedures. They needed to lose their humanity so completely that they could eat lunch beside corpses without cognitive dissonance. Jinshi had spent his whole life learning to be that kind of efficient, clinical administrator. The palace had trained him perfectly for it, taught him to see people as pieces on a board and morality as a strategic consideration rather than a guiding principle. And now, watching Umbrella operatives implement their authorized atrocities, he finally understood what that training had been preparing him to become. A monster with clearance, an administrator with a body count, a professional who could authorize horrors with the same casual efficiency most people used to approve expense reports. He refused, not dramatically, not with grand declarations, but with small, deliberate choices. Feeling horror instead of detachment, acknowledging grief instead of clinical observation, maintaining his humanity even when functionality would be easier without it, because the real survival, the kind that mattered beyond just continuing to breathe, required remaining human in a world where being human was increasingly disadvantageous. The executions would continue. Umbrella would keep processing unauthorized survivors with bureaucratic efficiency. Jinshi would keep documenting them, bearing witness even when it cost him pieces of himself he'd never get back. But he would do it as a human witnessing atrocity, not as an administrator processing data. He would remain capable of horror, of anger, of the messy emotions that made clinical efficiency impossible but humanity possible. Because in the end, the difference between Jinshi and the Umbrella operatives wasn't authorization or weaponry or operational capability. It was the simple, terrible choice to remain human even when being human hurt, to feel horror even when detachment was easier, to refuse the comfortable numbness that came with transforming people into paperwork. The monsters had clearance, authorization, and operational protocols. Jinshi just had his humanity, as broken and compromised as it was. And somehow, in this world of authorized atrocities and bureaucratic execution that felt like the only thing worth fighting to preserve, the first leak was almost accidental, though Jinshi would later claim he'd planned it from the beginning. He'd been monitoring Umbrella communications for weeks, cataloging their operational frequencies and encryption patterns, learning the rhythms of their corporate communications the way he'd once learned the rhythms of palace gossip. Most of what he intercepted was mundane, supply requisitions, personnel transfers, status reports that documented the slow machinery of corporate survival logistics. But occasionally, something interesting emerged from the static, something that revealed the cracks in Umbrella's carefully maintained facade of control. The document he intercepted was labeled Regional Containment Assessment Sector 7, and it was catastrophically honest in ways corporate communications rarely were. Someone had written a brutally frank analysis of Umbrella's failure to contain the outbreak, complete with casualty projections, resource depletion timelines, and a frank acknowledgement that their current strategy was unsustainable. The assessment concluded that Umbrella was losing control of the narrative, that independent survivor groups were proving more resilient than models predicted, and that the corporation's execution protocols were creating more problems than they solved by generating survivor hostility and resistance. Jinshi read the document 3 times, his analytical mind immediately recognizing its value not for what it said, but for what it represented: a crack in corporate certainty, an admission of failure buried in classified communications. This was the kind of information that could destabilize, not because it revealed shocking secrets, but because it contradicted Umbrella's public posture of complete control. The corporation had spent months projecting confidence, assuring remaining government entities and international observers that the outbreak was manageable, that casualties were within acceptable parameters, that their intervention was effective and necessary. This document proved they were lying. More importantly, it proved they knew they were lying. Miguel found Jinshi in the radio room at 3 in the morning, staring at the printed document with an expression that suggested he was working through calculations that went far beyond simple intelligence assessment. "You're thinking about leaking it," Miguel said, not quite a question. "I'm thinking about what happens if certain people see this," Jinshi replied carefully. "Not everyone, not publicly, but strategically, specific individuals who would find this information destabilizing in useful ways." "Like who?" "Like the military commanders still trying to coordinate evacuation operations. Like the government officials who have been accepting Umbrella's assessment that corporate intervention is the only viable strategy. Like Umbrella's own middle management, who probably don't realize how badly the upper leadership thinks this is going." Jinshi set down the document and looked at Miguel directly. "Information has power based on who receives it and when. This document means nothing to random survivors. We already know Umbrella is failing. We're living in that failure. But to people who have been basing their decisions on Umbrella's projected competence, this could change everything." "That's not just intelligence gathering," Miguel said slowly. "That's information warfare. That's you deciding to actively destabilize Umbrella's operations." Yes, Jinshi didn't apologize or justify, just acknowledge the truth of what he was proposing. They've been killing survivors with bureaucratic efficiency, processing people like administrative problems. I can't stop them with force. We don't have the resources or capability. But I can attack what they actually value, which is control over their narrative and their corporate image. I can make them afraid of their own information, uncertain about what I know and who I might tell. Miguel was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "If you do this, they'll come for you, not with extraction offers or immunity research proposals, with the same teams that executed those office-building survivors." "Probably," Jinshi agreed, "but they have to find me first, and they have to decide I'm worth the resources. Right now, we're strategically invisible, valuable enough to leave alone, not threatening enough to warrant elimination. This would change that calculation, make me dangerous instead of merely competent, make us a target instead of a known but manageable variable." "So why do it?" Jinshi considered the question carefully, trying to articulate something he'd only partially formed in his own mind. "Because I'm tired of documenting atrocities without consequence. Because bearing witness means nothing if it doesn't eventually become action. Because Umbrella operates on the assumption that they control information completely, and I want to prove they don't. Because," he paused, searching for honesty, "because I need to do something that matters beyond just surviving another day. Even if it's dangerous, even if it accelerates our targeting, even if it ultimately gets us killed, at least it's action instead of passive observation." The leak happened 3 days later, but not the way Miguel expected. Jinshi didn't broadcast the document publicly or try to reach mass audiences. Instead, he carefully selected 3 recipients and tailored the information each received to their specific contexts and concerns. The military commander coordinating evacuation from an adjacent sector received excerpts about Umbrella's resource depletion and unsustainable casualty rates, framed to suggest that military forces were being committed to support failing corporate operations. The government liaison still trying to coordinate official response received sections about Umbrella's narrative control strategy and their deliberate manipulation of casualty statistics. And Umbrella's own regional operations manager, someone Jinshi had identified through communications intercepts as competent, but excluded from upper-level strategy discussions, received the complete document with a simple note: "Your superiors don't think you'll succeed. Thought you should know." Each leak was small, targeted, designed to create specific reactions rather than general chaos. Jinshi didn't want panic. He wanted doubt, questions, the slow erosion of trust that came when people realized they'd been operating on incomplete or deliberately misleading information. He wanted Umbrella's partners to start questioning their commitments, their middle managers to start questioning their orders, their entire operational structure to begin experiencing the kind of internal friction that preceded organizational collapse. The effects took 2 weeks to manifest, but when they did, they exceeded Jinshi's projections. The military commander pulled his forces back from joint operations with Umbrella, citing resource reallocation, but making it clear through his communications that he no longer trusted corporate assessments. The government liaison started demanding verification of Umbrella's casualty figures and operational effectiveness data, threatening to withdraw official authorization for their execution protocols. And the regional operations manager, a woman named Claire Rodriguez, who'd apparently been as frustrated with her exclusion from strategic planning as Jinshi had anticipated, started asking uncomfortable questions in internal communications about whether field operatives were being given accurate information about outbreak progression and containment viability. Jinshi monitored all of it through his communications intercepts, watching his carefully planted seeds of doubt germinate into operational friction and organizational uncertainty. Umbrella's response was predictable but satisfying. They launched an internal investigation to identify the leak source, tightened their communications security, and sent increasingly frantic classified messages trying to contain the damage and reassure their partners and personnel that everything was under control. Which, of course, only made it more obvious that things were not under control. The second leak came 3 weeks after the first, and this time Jinshi was more aggressive. He'd intercepted communications about Umbrella's execution protocols, the authorization procedures, target selection criteria, and operational guidelines that transformed murder into corporate policy. This was uglier information than resource assessments and containment failures. This was documentation of systematic atrocity, complete with casualty counts and efficiency metrics that treated human lives like production quotas. Jinshi knew this leak was more dangerous, that releasing information about executions would make him a direct threat to Umbrella's operations rather than just an intelligence nuisance. But he also knew it was necessary, that the execution protocols represented the moral core of what made Umbrella monstrous. People could rationalize corporate incompetence, excuse failed containment strategies, accept that difficult decisions had to be made in crisis situations. But execution protocols with efficiency metrics, casualty quotas, target selection criteria that included uncooperative survivor groups and independent success models, that was harder to rationalize away. This leak went to different recipients. Survivor groups Jinshi had been monitoring through radio communications, independent military units still operating in the region, and most importantly, international observers who'd been documenting the outbreak from outside the hot zone. He sent encrypted transmissions with just enough information to be credible, but not enough to be easily traced, letting recipients verify details through their own intelligence before deciding what to do with the information. The response was immediate and chaotic. Survivor groups that had been considering Umbrella contact or extraction offers suddenly went dark, fortifying their positions and treating all corporate approaches with extreme suspicion. Military units started refusing to cooperate with Umbrella operations, and several commanders openly questioned the corporation's methods and objectives. International observers began publishing reports about alleged systematic elimination of non-compliant survivors that, while carefully worded to avoid definitive accusations, made it clear that Umbrella's actions were under scrutiny. Umbrella's reaction escalated proportionally. They locked down communications, initiated aggressive counterintelligence operations, and began systematically eliminating potential leak sources. Jinshi watched through his intercepts as 3 Umbrella personnel who'd had access to execution, protocol documentation, were quietly transferred to secure facilities and subsequently disappeared from all communications. The corporation was eating its own, sacrificing mid-level administrators to protect upper management and maintain the illusion that they could plug the leaks through internal purges. The council meeting where Jinshi revealed what he'd been doing was inevitable, though he'd delayed it as long as possible. David had started noticing the increased Umbrella activity in their region, the aggressive communication sweeps, the heightened security protocols. He'd connected it to the leaked information that was circulating through survivor networks and military channels, and he'd correctly identified Jinshi as the most likely source. "You're the leak," David said without preamble when he cornered Jinshi in the supply room. Not an accusation exactly, more like confirmation of something he'd already concluded. You've been leaking Umbrella intelligence, destabilizing their operations, making yourself and all of us into targets. Yes, Jinshi confirmed, because lying would be pointless and David deserved honesty, even if he wouldn't like the answer. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you ask if we were willing to take that risk? Because you would have said no, Jinshi replied simply. And you would have been right to say no. It's dangerous, it escalates our threat profile, it transforms us from survivors into active resistance. But I did it anyway because someone needed to, because Umbrella's control depends on information monopoly, and I had the capability to break that monopoly even if I didn't have the authority. David's expression was caught somewhere between anger and resigned acceptance. So now what? We're on Umbrella's target list because you decided to wage information warfare without consulting anyone. We were always on Umbrella's target list, Jinshi corrected. We just weren't prioritized because we seemed manageable. Now we're a higher priority, yes, but we're also more valuable alive than dead. I've made myself into someone who clearly has deep intelligence access and the capability to leak strategically damaging information. Umbrella has to decide whether eliminating me is worth the risk that I've set up dead man switches or automated leaks that would activate if I disappeared. They have to wonder what else I know, who else I've shared information with, what other damage I could do if they forced me into a corner. That's a hell of a gamble. It's the only gamble that changes our strategic position from passive survival to active influence. Jinshi met David's eyes steadily. We can keep our heads down, stay invisible, hope Umbrella never decides we're worth processing, or we can make ourselves valuable enough and dangerous enough that eliminating us becomes more complicated than leaving us alone. I chose the second option because the first one only works until it doesn't. The full council meeting that night was tense, with opinions sharply divided. Jennifer was furious that Jinshi had made decisions that affected everyone without consultation. Sarah was terrified that they'd gone from relative safety to active targets. Marcus was pragmatically concerned about whether they had the resources to defend against an Umbrella assault if it came. But it was Malma who cut through the emotional reactions with the question that actually mattered. "What's your endgame?" she asked Jinshi directly. "You're not just leaking information randomly. There's a pattern, a strategy. You're trying to accomplish something specific. What is it?" Jinshi had been waiting for someone to ask this, had been preparing his answer even though he wasn't sure anyone would understand or accept it. "I'm trying to collapse Umbrella's operational control by making them afraid of their own information. They're a corporation. They operate on hierarchy, compartmentalization, need-to-know protocols. That structure only works if people trust it, if mid-level managers trust upper management, if field operatives trust their mission parameters, if partners trust their assessments. I'm breaking that trust systematically by revealing that upper management is lying to middle management, that field operatives are implementing protocols based on false premises, that partners are making decisions based on deliberately manipulated information." He paused, making sure everyone was following. Every leak creates doubt, every revelation makes someone question their orders, their information, their trust in the organizational structure. And once that doubt starts spreading, it's almost impossible to contain. Umbrella will spend more resources investigating leaks than executing survivors. They'll purge their own personnel, tighten security so much that it impedes their operations, become so paranoid about information control that they can't function effectively. I'm not trying to destroy them with revelations. I'm trying to make them destroy themselves through paranoia and internal friction. The room was quiet as people processed this. Finally, Miguel spoke up, his voice uncertain. "That's actually brilliant and terrifying. You're weaponizing their own organizational structure against them." "It's what I know how to do," Jinshi said simply. "The palace taught me how organizations fall apart from the inside, how information can be more destructive than any weapon, how paranoia spreads through hierarchies like infection. Umbrella is just another court, another power structure dependent on trust and information control. I'm attacking what they actually value, and they don't have effective defenses because they're not used to information flowing against their control." The third leak came 5 weeks after the second, and this time Jinshi was surgical in his precision. He'd identified 3 key Umbrella personnel whose relationships represented critical nodes in their operational network, partnerships between field commanders and research directors, between regional managers and corporate leadership, between military liaisons and civilian administration. He leaked specific communications that would make each party doubt the other's honesty, competence, or loyalty. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would obviously appear to be manipulation. Just carefully selected messages that, when revealed to the wrong recipient, would create exactly the kind of interpersonal friction that preceded organizational collapse. A field commander learned that his research director contact had been reporting his insufficient commitment to protocol compliance. A regional manager discovered that corporate leadership had been discussing her limited strategic vision and potential replacement. A military liaison found communications suggesting his civilian administration counterpart was negotiating independent deals with Umbrella's competitors. None of it was fabricated. Jinshi had simply found real communications that, when revealed strategically, would maximize damage to professional relationships and organizational trust. The effects cascaded beautifully, each broken relationship creating ripples that destabilized adjacent connections. The field commander stopped sharing intelligence with his research director, forcing duplicate work and operational inefficiency. The regional manager began hoarding information and resources, protecting her position at the cost of broader organizational effectiveness. The military liaison withdrew cooperation from civilian administration, creating coordination failures that impeded joint operations. And each of these fractures created opportunities for additional leaks, additional doubt, additional erosion of the trust that held Umbrella's operations together. Jinshi watched it all unfold through his communications intercepts, making careful notes about which relationships were breaking down and where the organization was becoming most vulnerable. He was looking for the critical failure point, the moment when internal paranoia and operational friction would exceed Umbrella's ability to maintain effective outbreak management. He was trying to identify when the corporation would become more concerned with protecting itself from information warfare than with implementing its execution protocols and containment strategies. That moment came 11 weeks after the first leak, announced through an encrypted internal communication. Jinshi intercepted at 4 a.m. Umbrella's regional command was implementing Operation Consolidation, a complete operational restructure that would centralize decision-making, eliminate independent field authority, and require all communications to flow through monitored channels with multiple verification protocols. It was exactly the kind of paranoid overreaction Jinshi had been hoping to provoke, the kind of security theater that would cripple operational effectiveness while making leadership feel like they were regaining control. The communication outlined new protocols that were almost comically restrictive. Field commanders would need authorization for routine decisions. Intelligence sharing would require approval from 3 separate directors. Even supply requisitions would need verification from regional headquarters. It was organizational paralysis dressed up as security enhancement, and it would make Umbrella's operations so slow and bureaucratic that they'd be effectively neutered as a threat to independent survivors. Jinshi read the communication 3 times, a smile slowly spreading across his face, the first genuine smile Miguel had seen from him in weeks. "They're collapsing," Jinshi said quietly, almost reverently. Not dramatically, not with explosions or revelations, just quietly suffocating themselves with their own security protocols because they're more afraid of information leaks than operational ineffectiveness. "Is that what you wanted?" Miguel asked, reading over his shoulder. "It's exactly what I wanted. They're no longer focused on hunting survivors or implementing execution protocols. They're focused on protecting themselves from internal threats, investigating their own personnel, restricting information flow so tightly that they can't function effectively. They've become paralyzed by paranoia, which means they're no longer an active threat to survivor groups who stay off their radar." The council meeting that morning was celebratory in ways their previous meetings hadn't been. For the first time in months, they were discussing Umbrella as a diminishing threat rather than an existential danger. Field reports indicated reduced execution operations, decreased patrols, and evidence that Umbrella was pulling back to more defensible positions rather than actively hunting uncooperative survivors. The corporation that had systematically processed unauthorized survivors for months was now too consumed with internal security concerns to maintain its aggressive operational tempo. But Jinshi knew better than to celebrate completely. Organizations this paranoid were unpredictable, and cornered entities often lashed out in dangerous ways. He kept monitoring Umbrella communications, watching for signs that they'd identified him as the leak source or that they were planning retaliatory operations. He prepared contingency plans, established fallback positions, created multiple scenarios for how they might need to respond if Umbrella decided to commit significant resources to eliminating the information warfare threat. The threat materialized 6 days later, but not in the way Jinshi expected. Captain Harris made contact through their encrypted channel, his voice carrying none of the professional neutrality of their previous communications. "You're the leak," Harris said without preamble. "We've traced enough patterns to be confident." The intelligence access, the timing of releases, the strategic targeting of specific relationships and operational nodes, it's sophisticated enough that it has to be someone with intelligence training and deep understanding of organizational vulnerabilities. That's you. Jinshi considered denying it, playing ignorant, maintaining operational security, but Harris had already confirmed he knew, and lying would just insult both their intelligences. "Yes," he said simply. Why? Not angry, just genuinely curious. You could have stayed invisible, maintained your intelligence access, continued providing us with information about infected patterns and survivor groups. Instead, you've systematically destabilized our entire regional operation, destroyed professional relationships, and created enough internal paranoia that we've had to implement protocols that make us operationally ineffective. Why would you do that when we'd left you and your people alone? Because leaving us alone isn't the same as not being a threat, Jinshi replied. You were executing survivors with bureaucratic efficiency, processing people like administrative problems, implementing protocols that transformed murder into corporate policy. I couldn't stop you with force, so I attacked what you actually valued: your organizational control, your information monopoly, your internal trust. I made you afraid of your own communications, suspicious of your own personnel, so paranoid about information security that you'd cripple yourselves trying to prevent additional leaks. The silence that followed was long enough that Jinshi wondered if Harris had terminated the connection. Finally, the captain spoke again, his voice carrying something that might have been respect or might have been resignation. "That's actually impressive. Ruthless, destabilizing, and probably going to get you killed, but impressive. You've done more damage to our operations with leaked communications than any survivor group has done with weapons and resistance. You've turned our own organizational structure into a weapon against us." "It's what I know how to do," Jinshi said, echoing his words to the council. "I'm not a soldier or a scientist or someone who could fight you directly, but I understand how organizations work, how information flows through hierarchies, how trust holds structures together and paranoia tears them apart. So I fought you with the weapons I actually possessed." "And now what?" Harris asked. "Now that we know it's you, now that we can trace the leaks directly to your location, what happens next? Do we extract you for interrogation, eliminate you before you can do more damage, try to recruit you because you're clearly too valuable to waste? You decide whether I'm worth the resources," Jinshi replied calmly. "Eliminating me requires committing a significant operational team to an area you've already determined is low priority. And you have to wonder whether I've established dead man switches, automated leaks that would activate if I disappeared, information caches that would be released by associates if I was killed, additional intelligence I haven't revealed yet that would become public if you forced my hand. Recruiting me requires trusting that I wouldn't continue undermining you from inside your organization, which seems unlikely given what I've already demonstrated. So your real options are leaving me alone and hoping I'm satisfied with the damage I've done, or spending resources you can't afford on an elimination operation that might create more problems than it solves." Harris laughed, a short, sharp sound without much humor. "You've thought this through completely, made yourself simultaneously too dangerous to ignore and too expensive to eliminate effectively. That's exactly the kind of strategic positioning that makes you valuable and infuriating in equal measure." "I learned from the palace," Jinshi said quietly, "how to be indispensable and untouchable at the same time, how to position yourself so that eliminating you creates more problems than tolerating you. It's survival strategy when you're not powerful enough to defend yourself through strength." The communication ended without resolution, Harris neither confirming nor denying what Umbrella would do next. Jinshi reported the conversation to the council, prepared them for possible retaliation, established evacuation protocols in case Umbrella decided the elimination operation was worth the resources. But weeks passed without incident. and gradually it became clear that Harris had made his recommendation and Umbrella had accepted it. Jinshi was too dangerous to trust, too expensive to eliminate, and too strategically positioned to be worth the risk of forcing confrontation. They would leave him alone, monitor him carefully, and hope that his information warfare had achieved whatever objectives he'd intended, and he'd be satisfied with the damage already done. The irony wasn't lost on Jinshi. He'd spent months watching Umbrella execute survivors who represented administrative complications, who existed outside corporate control, who proved that independent survival was possible. He documented their atrocities, borne witness to their systematic elimination of uncooperative variables. And now, through careful strategy and information warfare, he'd made himself into exactly the kind of uncooperative variable they couldn't afford to eliminate. He'd proven that the same organizational structures they used to implement control could be weaponized against them. That information was more powerful than authorization when deployed strategically. Mao found him on the roof 3 months after the first leak, looking out at a city where Umbrella's presence had visibly diminished. Fewer patrols, less aggressive operations, more survivor groups existing without constant fear of execution. The corporation hadn't collapsed completely. They still controlled significant resources and maintained operations in priority sectors. But they'd pulled back, become more defensive, lost the aggressive confidence that had made them the greater threat than the infected themselves. "You did this," Mao said, gesturing at the changed operational landscape. "You turned their secrecy against them, made them so afraid of information warfare that they crippled their own effectiveness. I'm not sure whether it's brilliant or terrifying." "Both," Jinshi replied. "It's both, and I'm still not sure I made the right choice. I've potentially saved lives by making Umbrella less aggressive, but I've also made enemies of people who authorize executions and treat murder like paperwork. The cost-benefit analysis is complicated." "Would you do it again? Knowing what you know now, would you still choose information warfare over staying invisible?" Jinshi considered the question carefully, watching smoke rise from distant fires where infected gathered and survivors defended their small territories of relative safety. "Yes," he said finally, "because bearing witness without consequence isn't enough, because documenting atrocities only matters if it eventually becomes action, because they taught me to use information as a weapon, and then they were surprised when I actually did it. So yes, I'd do it again. Even knowing the risks, even accepting that I've made myself a permanent target, even understanding that this might eventually get me killed." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who understood strategy and survival and the complicated ethics of fighting monsters. With the weapons monsters had taught you to use, and Jinshi knew that he'd crossed a line, transformed from passive observer to active participant, from someone who documented the collapse to someone who accelerated it. He turned secrecy against the masters of secrecy, weaponized information against those who'd built their power on information control. It wasn't heroism, it was just another kind of survival, another way of refusing to be the person the palace and Umbrella and every hierarchical power structure had tried to make him become. He'd fought with leaked communications instead of weapons, with strategic doubt instead of force, with organizational friction instead of violence. And somehow, in this world of authorized atrocities and bureaucratic execution, that felt like the most human form of resistance possible. The collapse of control had begun with a single leaked document and cascaded through relationships and trust networks until an entire organizational structure started eating itself from paranoia. Jinshi had orchestrated it all from a radio room in a warehouse, armed with nothing but intelligence access and understanding of how hierarchies destroyed themselves when they stopped trusting their own information. The monsters had clearance and authorization, but Jinshi had secrets, strategy, and the patience to watch organizational paranoia do more damage than any weapon could accomplish. And in the end, that had been enough to transform from target to threat, from survivor to something more dangerous, someone who understood that in the information age, the greatest power wasn't controlling what people knew, but controlling what people feared others might know about them.